areas. And that's why in a few weeks' time, I hope, we're going to be launching a new comms campaign about this. Because the truth is, it affects so many people in so many different ways that what we're trying to do now is to make sure people know what's going on so that they can actually claim the help and support they need to make sure we defeat this pernicious evil.
Ray Morris.
Isn't it true that police simply do not have the resources or expertise to tackle fraud? I have a constituent still waiting for a charging decision, 5 years after being the victim of fraud. Her retirement's been ruined, waiting for the police and the CPS to make a charging decision. Durham Constabulary has a single forensic account. Does the Minister believe, as I do, that a lack of specialist resources is leading to these unacceptable delays in justice?
Well, I completely understand his point, which is exactly why this government has introduced a new National Fraud Squad, which is almost fully recruited now at 400, and has increased funding available to forces in order to fight fraud. There are some forces that are doing exceptionally well at this already. Avon is doing extremely well, and of course City of London Police is doing exceptionally well at leading on fraud nationally.
Stephen Bonner.
Free, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Office engages with the devolved nations through the interministerial group and recognises that each of the nations of the UK have varying immigration needs, reflected in the varied shortage occupation lists for each nation. Immigration will, however, remain reserved. It's not possible to operate distinct systems without effectively creating an internal UK migration border system.
Stephen Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Figures from the ONS have revealed that changes to the minimum income threshold for family and skilled workers disproportionately impact Scotland. Median earnings on the west coast of Scotland are at £24,700 a year. That's far shorter than even the climb down figure of £29,000. Yep. So did the Home Secretary even consider this insular policy effectively cuts off migration to parts of Scotland in areas where we need and would benefit from inward migration?
Well, the government's position is clear that the changes that we are introducing are the right thing. The numbers of dependents that we're seeing coming, for example, is disproportionate, and there will, of course, be the opportunity through the review of the immigration salary list and the composition of that in the second phase, a chance through the call for evidence for exactly those sorts of debates to be had and for those views to be made known.
SNP spokesperson Alison Toogood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Office's knee-jerk policy to raise the threshold and then their sudden partial reverse ferret to bring it back down again slightly caused a huge amount of distress to people up and down these islands who don't know now what the future holds for them and their families. Can I ask the Minister what quality impact assessment has been carried out on this policy, which will disproportionately, as well as affecting Scotland, will disproportionately affect women?
Well, the Home Secretary made a commitment when he announced these changes to lay the information in the House Library around the projected volumes. It seems to me that she's criticising the government for not taking the steps that we have taken to say very clearly that these changes will not be applied retrospectively. We think that that is the right thing to do. We think that it's provided reassurance to people, but ultimately we do need to get net migration under control, and we think that this is a pragmatic and sensible package to take forward.
Alison Toogood.
That does not answer the question that I put to the Minister at all. What quality impact assessment has been carried out on this policy? What recognition of wage levels in Scotland has been carried out on this policy? He can't tell me. What my constituents tell me is that they are worried about their spouse coming over from Australia who works as a legal administrator, a man who's worried about his nephew and his partner, that they'll never be able to return from Canada if they want to come back to live in Scotland, and many, many more who are guilty only of falling in love with somebody of what the government considers the wrong nationality. Will he apologise to them for the chaos that their policies have caused?
The position is as per that which I have set out. We think that the number of people coming to this country in this way is not sustainable. This is a pragmatic, balanced package that we are taking forward. And as I've said, these measures will not be applied retrospectively, and so it does not affect existing applications that have been lodged.
Sarah Dunn.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government takes domestic burglary very, very seriously indeed. That is why we obtained a commitment from police just over a year ago to always attend every incident of residential burglary, and that is delivering results because year on year, residential burglary has fallen, according to the crime survey, by 8%.
Sir Adai.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his response. In 2022, the cost of rural theft in the South West rose by 16.6% from the year before. Has the Minister made an assessment of the success of the new National Rural Crime Unit with regards to improving police contacts with victims of rural theft?
Well, I agree with the Honourable Lady. Combating rural crime is extremely important, and the rural crime unit she refers to is designed to do exactly that. We are, of course, also legislating. We have legislated and will be implementing the legislation to ensure that things like all-terrain vehicles and agricultural equipment have to be marked or fitted with an immobiliser. But let's, just for the House's benefit, since 2010, overall domestic burglary has fallen by 57%.
John Penrose.
Question 5, Mr Speaker.
Question 5. Oh. Mr Speaker, so it is. I thought I was going to get just a moment off there. I did get a moment off. I thank my honourable friend for his question. The drug strategy commitments are being delivered, including investing over £300 million in additional treatment capacity, creating over 50,000 extra treatment places, but also enforcing hard, for example, by closing down over 2,000 county lines since 2019.
Mr Speaker, local police in and around Weston-super-Mare have had notable successes in disrupting drug dealing and supply, but new dealers quickly take the place of the old ones. The quantities of drugs and the numbers of addicts aren't declining. Would the Minister accept that while enforcement and education are vital, they aren't enough to solve this problem on their own, and that the underlying legal frameworks which we use to control these dangerous chemicals have to be addressed too?
Well, enforcement is important. Besides closing down those 2,000 county lines, Border Force in the year ending March 22, for example, seized around about 19 tonnes of cocaine, the largest amount seized in a single year on record. I've mentioned treatment already. The most important thing is to get people out of their addiction entirely, and that's why we're investing so much extra money in treatment. In terms of the legal framework, there are no plans to change that. Drugs are illegal for a reason. They're highly addictive and harmful. And if you look at some jurisdictions that have liberalised significantly, for example, California, San Francisco, and so on, the out-of-control public drug consumption in those jurisdictions is not something we want to see happening in this country.
Mr Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for that response. Minister, the problem for us in Northern Ireland where drugs escalating, the consumption, the movement of drugs, it's coming from England to Northern Ireland. It's also coming from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland as well. Can I ask the Minister what discussions he'd be able to have with the Republic of Ireland to ensure that the drugs across the border can be stopped, and also coming from England to Northern Ireland as well? Thanks very much.
Well, I think the honourable member raises an important point. Of course, one of the features of the island of Ireland is that there is essentially no border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which does, of course, pose various challenges, and he's alluded to them in his question. I would be happy to take this up and see what more there is to do, we can do to disrupt the supply of drugs north-south and east-west as well. So I thank him for raising the issue.
Number 6, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to group this question with 14, 20, 22 and 25. We're making significant progress in closing hotels, with 50 due to be closed by the end of January and more in the coming months. We're also working to move asylum seekers into alternative, cheaper accommodation and have successfully cleared the legacy backlog by deciding more than 112,000 cases, whilst maintaining the integrity of the system.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last year, after raising concerns by me, the police, the fire service, the Home Office did close the Oyo Hotel in Earl Shilton. However, Leicestershire still does have hotels open. Just over the border in Appleby Magna, for example, my constituents are concerned. Now, would he set out a timeline about when these hotels may close, or more likely set out a suitability for those hotels that are least suitable to be closed first, so that as the backlog is dealt with, so does the closing of the hotels fall in line too?
Well, as I was able to set out, we are making good progress, and I hear calls from colleagues across the House for closures in their constituencies. We need to stick the course around the delivery of this, taking into account a number of factors, including the ease of exit, the speed of exit, the fact that notice periods come into play, but also, crucially, value for money, which is what I think the taxpayer would rightly expect.
Through.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In welcoming my honourable friend to his new position, can I urge him to finally make good on the promise of his predecessor to close the temporary accommodation centres in my constituency and restore 2 hotels back to their intended purpose? And could he also work with his colleagues in the Department for Levelling Up to ensure that the local links rule relating to social housing is amended to prevent Oros from being disproportionately burdened by new applications once residents are awarded asylum?
Well, I hear my honourable friend's calls for the specific hotel in her constituency to be closed, and she can be absolutely reassured that this is something that we will continue to work closely with colleagues across government to get right, to make sure that we can exit hotels as quickly as possible. As I say, I hear her point.
And the Wheeler.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for his earlier answers. As you know, today I received official notification that Newton Park Hotel, which was a 4-star hotel in the South Derbyshire constituency, which use had been taken over entirely by asylum seekers, is to have the contract ended at the end of February. This is an enormous relief to those in this small village and indeed in other villages where the important V3 bus route goes through. Can I thank him for keeping to the word of his predecessor that the hotel use for asylum seekers would end in the second tranche of closures?
The situation in my honourable friend's constituency, and I'm grateful to her for the representations that she has made on this issue, demonstrates that the government's plan is working, that we are seeing those hotel exits happen, and that is a direct consequence of getting on and making decisions, bringing forward alternative accommodation, but also, and I think this is the crucial point, reducing inflow into the system in the first place.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the progress that's been made on illegal small road crossings, which has meant it's been possible to end the use of the North Stafford Hotel in Stoke-on-Trent. But would my honourable friend agree that it's only through the most unequivocal legislations on Rwanda, which we can deliver proper deterrence that will mean that numbers will come down further?
The point that my honourable friend makes absolutely gets to the nub of the issue. One of the most important factors in terms of sustaining the progress that we have made is to reduce the number of inflows into the UK, particularly via those small boat crossings of the Channel. And that is why my message to the House is clear, that if you want to see hotels closed, you want to see the progress sustained, need to be in the lobby supporting the bill this week.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. My constituents and I were delighted at the end of last year to see the end of the Ibis Hotel in Bramley being used to house illegal immigrants and return to normal service. Can the Minister reassure me that any forthcoming immigration legislation passed by this House will make sure that this will never happen again, either by banning the use of hotels outright and make sure that those illegal immigrants are instead sent to Rwanda for processing?
As I've said, the key principle behind the bill is to help us to bring to an end these egregious crossings of the Channel organised by evil criminal gangs that help us to ensure that there is greater control of our borders and that makes sure that there are not these inflows into the system that undoubtedly have had the consequence of needing to respond to that challenge through the opening of hotels. That's precisely what we're trying to put a stop to.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dave Downing-Jones.
Last week, the Times reported that there are 10,000 hotel beds going unused at a cost of £1.5 million a day. This is in addition to the 3,500 buffer of empty beds held as a contingency in case of Manston being overwhelmed. Are those figures actually correct?
The Right Honourable Lady will recognise that it is, of course, important for there to be a buffer to make sure that operationally we have the bed spaces that are required in a contingency situation to be able to respond to any surges and any particular challenges. That is a difficult area, but it is one that we are looking at very carefully. We are, of course, within the hotel estate, maximising the use of bed spaces wherever possible, which again helps us to get on and close these hotels in the way that I think she would want to see.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The downside of the volume of asylum applications being granted is the pressure that's putting on local authority homeless sections. Will the Minister have another look at the time that's given asylum seekers from the date their application is accepted to the date they have to move out of Home Office accommodation, from the 28 days to the 56 days, which is the recognised limit under the Homeless Reduction Act? Otherwise, all we're going to do is transfer people from Home Office funded hotels to local authority funded hotels with all the extra pressure of financial problems that creates for local authorities.
Hear, hear. One of the things that we're doing with local authorities is working with them around the dates to try and give as early a visibility as possible as to the anticipated numbers that people and that local authorities should be expecting to see with decisions being granted. That helps, of course, to forward plan. Very mindful of these points. There are no intentions to change that 28-day period as things stand. And again, I think clearly planning and working with local authorities is critical in all of this. It's also just worth saying that in many cases people will have more than 28 days through which to vacate.
Matt Martin.
Oldham has a proud history of supporting those fleeing persecution. As of March last year, our town is host to 910 asylum seekers, 145 of whom are in hotel accommodation. But here, the housing crisis meets the homeless crisis. 1,000 people in temporary accommodation, including 500 children. Isn't now the time for the government to review the dispersal policy to ensure that every part of England plays its fair share? And can I gently point out that Braintree is home to just 2 asylum seekers to Oldham's 910?
The honourable gentleman can be absolutely reassured that one of the things that I am looking at carefully as our officials is what more we can do to ensure that there is equitability around the approach to dispersal. That is absolutely critical. We do think that we need to work carefully through some of the pressures and challenges that these issues present. But again, I just make the point gently to the benches opposite that one of the key parts of the response to this is to get the flows into the system down, and they don't have a credible plan to do that.
Hi, Bedford.
Mr. Speaker, there are currently 56,000 people asylum seekers in hotels, and the Prime Minister promised to close those hotels sometime last year, but since then it's gone up by 10,000. Can you confirm that that figure is correct?
The figure that he has cited, and the figure that I think the Right Honourable Lady, the Shadow Home Secretary, used last week, I am clear in my mind does not represent the picture as it stands today. She will recognise, and he will recognise too, that there are periodic reportings around statistical releases, but the fact is the figures that they cite are not representative of the position on the ground today.
Martin Vickers.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll answer questions 7, 11 and 23 together. On the 4th of December, I announced a new package of measures to further reduce legal net migration, including limitations on family dependents being brought in by workers and students, increasing the salary threshold and raising the minimum income requirement progressively over the next few years.
Martin Vickers.
I thank my right honourable friend for his reply. He will know that the net migration figures of over 700,000 is completely unsustainable. It represents the creation of 10 new parliamentary constituencies each year if it were to continue. What cooperation does his department have with the public services which have to meet the demands from the newcomers?
He is absolutely right that we do need to be conscious of the impact on local populations and local authorities from the level of net migration. We recognise the figure is too high. We are taking action to bring that figure down. We work closely with other government departments in delivering on that. But I am struck that whilst the opposition front bench criticise the headline figure, the other opposition benches also oppose every single step that we take to bring that figure down.
So David Evan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and the Minister for Legal Migration for all their work towards delivering on our manifesto commitment to reduce net migration. My constituents are now looking for the results of all their hard work. However, could he outline how his new legal migration package makes the most of our post-Brexit points-based immigration system?
Mr. Speaker, this country has always had a global outlook. The ethnic composition of the government at the most senior levels is a direct reflection of our global connectivity and those human bridges across the world. We want to make sure that this country is able to benefit from the expertise, knowledge and work of the brightest and best from around the whole world in a manner which is controlled, which is fair, which is predictable and which is well enforced.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good that the government wants to ensure that the brightest and best can continue to come to the UK to study. But does my right honourable friend recognise that the changes to the family dependent rules for students risk causing enormous damage to some of our elite business schools who compete in the global marketplace for experienced, outstanding professionals? And what is he doing to work with the sector to try and overcome some of these challenges that are being created for them?
My right honourable friend is right to highlight the fact that we are in a globally competitive environment when it comes to the quality higher education and postgraduate offer that this country has. I have no doubt that we are still highly competitive. We will continue to work with the university sector on this and ensure that the people that we bring to the UK are here to study and add value, and that no institution in our higher education sector is mistaking their role. They are educators, they are not a backdoor visa system.
Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, can I beg the Home Secretary to spread his more enlightened views that he's just announced to some of his colleagues? Because migration shouldn't be a dirty word. I'm the son of a migrant. I migrated myself to the United States at one stage. My DNA tells me that I'm 34% Irish, 32% Swedish. Could we please have every member of this Parliament have their DNA published and bring some sense into this discussion about migration?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure the government is able to compel such widespread disclosures. Perhaps IPSA might have a view on such things. I'm immigrant stock on both sides of my family. My mother came to the UK in the 1960s. My father's family came to the UK in 1066. And this country has benefited from controlled immigration in a fair system where people who play by the rules are rewarded and we say no to those who refuse to play by the rules.
Speaker, I'm a legal migrant too. Bath has a vibrant hospitality industry that caters to local people and tourists from all over the world, but many of our hotels, restaurants, bars and pubs already struggle to find enough staff or under threat of closure or reduced working hours. How will he ensure that the new salary thresholds proposed under measures to reduce legal migration do not worsen these staff shortages?
We liaise very closely with other government departments to ensure that a system which is transparent and fair also supports the British economy. We work particularly closely with the Department of Work and Pensions to ensure that those people who have talent, who have ambition, but who currently, for whatever reason, are not fully engaged in the job market, are able to do so. We want the hospitality industry, I have a background in the hospitality industry myself, we want the hospitality industry in the UK to continue to thrive. It is not the case that we should automatically rely on overseas labour to do so. We can have homegrown talent as well.
Thank you. The Home Secretary talked about people coming to UK universities to study, but also there are many people that come to our universities to carry out groundbreaking and economically very important research, and they are very worried about the impact of the minimum income thresholds going up, because that means they won't be able to bring their families with them. What assessment has he made on the impact of the important research work that our universities are carrying out of the new changes?
As I say, we recognise the contribution of the international pool of talent. Indeed, when I was Foreign Secretary, I signed up a deal with India for talented postgraduates to exchange experience in our respective countries. We will always look to support the genuine draw on talent, but we will also make sure that the higher education system is not used as a backdoor means of immigration. It is there for research and education, not a backdoor means of getting permanent residence in this country.
Right, we come to Chris Elmore.
Number 8, sir. Because that's still me, I think. Mr. Speaker, giving police the resources that they need to police local communities and fight crime remains a priority for this government. We have delivered on our commitment to recruit 20,000 additional police officers. Indeed, we are over that. Decisions about how they are deployed are, of course, a discussion and a decision for chief constables and police and crime commissioners and mayors who are responsible to their local communities.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The legacy of cuts from this government has left police forces across England and Wales with a £3.2 billion cash shortfall. 6,000 frontline officers are now being taken away from frontline policing duties to complete the roles of former police staff. So can the Minister, can the Home Secretary in fact, start to acknowledge the Tory cuts? How is he going to rectify it and get more frontline police back onto our neighbourhoods across the United Kingdom?
Well, as I say, the decision for how a police force balances its back office, important back office roles and its frontline policing roles is rightly one for the Chief Constable. We have given additional resource. We have delivered on our commitment to have more police officers. Of course, we are looking at police funding formulas to ensure that they remain well-resourced, but there are more police officers now, over 20,000 more, in fact 20,947 additional officers in England and Wales. That will ensure that there are more police on the front line.
And the Minister Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my honourable friend says, that to this day we are still feeling the devastating impact of the Tories' decision to cut 20,000 police officers. Ministers, indeed the Home Secretary, seem to expect credit for desperately trying to reverse it, but the National Police Chiefs Council were right, weren't they? The efforts at reversal have moored 6,000 warranted officers in roles traditionally filled by civilians. Again, we've heard from the Home Secretary that we've never had it so good, but there are still 10,000 fewer neighbourhood police. Why won't they match our commitment for 13,000 more police and PCSOs out on the beat?
Match it.
Mr. Speaker, unless they actually have a plan for paying for those figures, it is just empty rhetoric. The simple truth of the matter is there are record numbers of police officers in police forces around the country. They have indeed, including Essex Police, who I visited this morning. They have never had more police officers than they currently have got. It is right for chief constables to decide how to deploy those police officers, but again, unless we hear from them a plan of paying for those additional officers, then I just won't trust their figures.
Richard Thompson.
Number 9, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been mindful of the need to balance the impacts on individual sectors with economic growth and the needs of the labour market with the need to reduce levels of immigration. As part of our policy development, we undertook analytical work across government which supports the decisions we made. A regulatory impact assessment will be developed in due course.
Richard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Director of Universities Scotland, Alistair Sim, has expressed concerns that changes to the government's visa's income threshold could affect the ability of universities to attract global talent. Now, international students and academics make a contribution in excess of £5 billion annually to the Scottish economy. Now, if this government, as it says, recognises the contributions of international students and academics, why are they introducing a policy which threatens to prevent future cohorts of those international students and academics from making a similar contribution into the future?
Well, I believe that individuals will still be able to make a valid contribution in the years ahead, but in a sustainable and managed way. There are no immediate plans to introduce further exemptions to the increased salary threshold, but the salary discounts remain in place presently. We will continue to engage as these measures are introduced, and I would also just say that there are opportunities domestically for recruitment, and I think we ought to be at every opportunity trying to support domestic recruitment wherever we can.
Minister.
Number 12, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Work is continuing to update the funding formula, and I'll update the House as soon as I am able to. But the House should be aware that next year, 2024-25, Police and Crime Commissioners funding frontline police will see their budgets increase by up to £922 million, an increase of around about 6%.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There's cross-party agreement that the current funding formula is unfair for police in Bedfordshire, with the Conservatives' own PCC acknowledging that there is simply no meat left on the bone for local police. My constituents are fed up of being told they've never had it so good or fobbed off with one-off grants. Will the Minister commit to a date to finally deliver a fair funding formula for my communities?
Well, what I'll commit to, as far as the people of Bedfordshire are concerned, is an increase next year, 24-25, an increase in funding of £10.2 million. That's an extra 6.5% compared to this year. And they also have 1,455 police officers. That is about 200 more than the Bedfordshire Police Force have ever had at any time in their history.
Fuller.
Unusual to hear from two Bedfordshire MPs when it comes back to the police funding formula, because this goes all the way back to the last Labour government. But there is cross-party view in Bedfordshire that Bedfordshire police are underfunded. So will my friend the Minister agree to meet with all the MPs of Bedfordshire so we can press the case for continued funding, increases in funding for Bedfordshire police?
Well, I'm always happy to meet my honourable friend to discuss these issues. As I say, Bedfordshire Police will receive an extra £10.2 million next year, an increase of about 6.5%, which I'm sure will be welcome up and down the county. But of course, yes, I'm happy to meet my honourable friend whenever he would like.
I presume that's all of them, was it, Minister? Fariel Clark, Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, not listening to police forces raising serious concerns about a funding formula and about how it's affecting, how it's limiting the ability to tackle town centre crime. The British Retail Consortium report that there are more than 850 acts of violence or abuse against shop workers every single day. Mr Speaker, everyone has a right to feel safe at work. So when will the Home Secretary accept that retail crime is out of control and accept Labour's plan to introduce a new law to protect retail workers from violence and actually stand up for shop workers?
Well, theft offences, of course, are down by 47% since 2010. But we have crime survey figures. But we have recently launched a retail crime action plan where police are committing to prioritise attendance at the incidents of retail crime and always follow reasonable lines of inquiry in relation to shoplifting, assaults against shop workers and other forms of offending as well. In addition to that, we legislated in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act in various ways.
Question 13, please, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, with permission, I will answer question 13 and 16 together. This government recognises the impact of neighbourhood crime. It's the crime that most affects people's confidence, both that of individuals, businesses and communities. The strategic response to this is evidence-based and targeted, and getting policing right in this area is incredibly important for maintaining community confidence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I've seen for myself how successful the government's Safer Streets Fund was in Barnstaple, and I'm delighted it's to be extended into Ilfracombe this year. Can my right honourable friend ensure that councils have the funding to help support these schemes?
I thank my honourable friend for highlighting this point. I'm very proud of the fact that since 2010, neighbourhood crime is down by 51% because of the kind of interventions that she has highlighted. I can reassure her that we will continue to look at what works, we will continue to fund and support, and we will continue to make every effort to drive down neighbourhood crime even further.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Police numbers across Devon and Cornwall are at record levels and they deserve our praise. In a recent survey, my constituents in East Devon said tackling neighbourhood crime is an absolute priority. That's ranging from burglaries to thefts from vehicles. Can my right honourable friend outline what progress this Conservative government has made on cracking down on neighbourhood crime?
Well, I'm very pleased that his local community are feeling the positive impact of the decisions we made. And since coming into government, we have seen serious violence reduced by 26% since the start of this Parliament. We have also seen neighbourhood crime down by 27% since the start of this Parliament. 36% reduction in domestic burglary, 18% reduction in vehicle-related theft, 61% decrease in robbery, 18% decrease in vehicle-related theft. We've reduced homicide by 15%. We have seen action on drugs, and we are committed to go.
I've got the same to the Minister, please. You were very slow at the beginning, and you're not going to be slow at the end, I'm sure. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited 5 co-op stores. Every single one of them had a daily experience of theft, one losing £35,000 worth of goods over 6 months, and staff experiencing assaults. In the light that Labour are introducing 13,000 more community policing and retail crime law, what is the Minister really doing? Because clearly his plan isn't working.
Mr. Speaker, we have a retail crime action plan. We have ensured that assaults against shop workers is an aggregating factor, and we have made it clear to police forces across the country that we expect them to take action on neighbourhood crime like this, and that they will pursue every reasonable line of inquiry. We are absolutely determined to drive down retail crime.
Question 17, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The objective of the Safer Streets Fund and the Safety of Women at Night Fund is to enhance public safety in a direct and targeted way, neighbourhood by neighbourhood. Since 2020, the Government has invested £150 million across the 2 funds, and the evaluation of round 1 of the Safer Streets Fund, which was published in January of last year, showed that the investment was boosting trust in the police and making communities feel safer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister justify the Government cut of 38% of funding for projects to reduce violence against women and girls in Merseyside?
Yeah.
And one project will have to cease.
Well, what I can tell the Honourable Lady is that under the Safer Streets Fund, £3.9 million has been allocated to Merseyside, including a project to St Helens Town Centre. Let me remind her very gently of what it's funding. It's gone towards lighting, signage, improvement to taxi ranks, and one of the most radical measures of all is that it provides women with a free taxi service home, where the Safer Streets Fund will reimburse the taxi driver for the money they would otherwise not have received, so that a woman doesn't have to find herself standing at a windy bus stop or walking home.
Shadow Minister Alex Davies-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We welcome the Safer Streets Fund, which will go some way to support the nighttime economy, which has been badly hit over 14 years. The Government's efforts to tackle spiking are also being completely undermined by the Home Secretary. Spiking is a serious and devastating offence. So why did the Home Secretary therefore think it was appropriate to joke about spiking his own wife? And can he confirm exactly how many drops of Rohypnol does he consider to be illegal?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. I think it has been widely reported that the Home Secretary was making a joke about not being good enough for his wife. The point is, we are the first government who has actually done something about spiking. It's not a new offence. The measures to change the statutory provisions in the Offences Against the Person Act could have been taken by the last Labour government. And actually the reason we've sought to clarify it in law is because we don't think that enough victims are coming forward. And the reason that we don't think there are enough prosecutions is because the time lag in getting effective toxicology reports, which is why we're investing so much money in rapid drinks testing kits, so that hopefully we'll be able to get the tests done on site, on the night, and get more of these offenders behind bars.
We now come to topicals. Kerry McCarthy.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this year the Home Office will continue to build on our progress on the public priorities. A 36% fall in small boats crossings last year, 86 arrests of small boat pilots, 246 arrests of people smugglers, the biggest ever international operation resulting in 136 boat seizures, 45 outboard motors being seized. We announced the legal migration package, more than 2,000 county lines, drugs lines smashed, the introduction of the Criminal Justice Bill to give the police leaders more powers. We are relentlessly focused on delivering community safety on behalf of the British people.
Now that we actually have the Home Secretary here to answer for himself, can he tell us if he is aware that the police are receiving more than 560 reports of spiking every month? And in December, the Home Office said the reason the crime is so prevalent is because it's seen as funny and a joke. How can we really have any confidence in the Home Secretary to deliver action on spiking when he himself thinks it's a joke?
Mr. Speaker, I am the Home Secretary who has actually introduced action on this. On my first week in the job, I visited Holborn Police Station to see the work of the Metropolitan Police there, tackling violence against women and girls. I made it clear to the Home Office that my priority was the protection of women and girls. I am taking action on this issue, and I am absolutely determined to continue to do so.
Nigel Wills.
I'm sure the Home Secretary would agree that anti-extremism training in government departments is extremely important. What more can the government do to ensure it actually is training to tackle extremism and not just anti-government and party bias training?
Well, the honourable member will have seen recently a pretty extraordinary report on allegations about extremism and the failure to train properly what is going on in universities around the United Kingdom. There was one recent problematic case where they said it was very hard to define what a terrorist is. But I think we know what a terrorist is, the law knows what a terrorist is, and this government knows what a terrorist is, and that's exactly why we've just prescribed Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We welcome the prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir. 5 more lives were tragically lost in the Channel this weekend. As criminal gangs profit from these dangerous boat crossings, it shows how vital it is to stop them. But we need the Home Office to have a grip. The Home Secretary gave no answer earlier on the 4,000 people he has lost from the Rwanda list. Can he tell us if he has also lost the 35,000 people he has removed from the asylum backlog? How many of them are still in the country?
Mr. Speaker, I join the Right Honourable Lady in expressing our sadness and condolences for those who lost their life in Channel, reinforcing the importance of breaking the people smuggling gangs. The fact is that we are driving down the numbers of people in the backlog. We are processing applications more quickly. We are ensuring that decisions are made so that those who should not be in this country can be removed either to their own country or safe third country. That is why the Rwanda bill is so very important. That's why we will continue working on these issues.
But returns have dropped 50% since the last Labour government, and he's still not telling us where these missing people are. He appears to have lost thousands of people who may have no right to be in the country and lost any grip at all. In the ongoing Tory asylum chaos, we've got cabinet ministers and countless ex-ministers and the deputy Tory chair all saying they oppose the Home Secretary's policy this week, a policy we know he and the Prime Minister don't even believe in. So, if the deputy Tory chair this week votes against the Home Secretary's policy, will he be sacked? Or is the Prime Minister so weak he's lost control of asylum, lost control of our borders and lost control of his own party too?
The members of Parliament on my side of the House are absolutely united in our desire, to get a grip of this issue. I am not the person who's held up a sign saying refugees welcome. I am not the person whose colleagues oppose each and every rhetorical flourish. And until the party opposite comes up with a credible plan, I will not be taking their criticism any more seriously than they deserve.
Blackburn.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry, I didn't hear you. The British people welcome people that come to this country and work and contribute to our economy. But those that abuse our hospitality, commit violent offences and are then sent to prison, need to be deported at the end of their sentences. So will my right honourable friend update the House on how many were deported last year and what action he's going to take to ensure that it's automatic that violent offenders leaving prison who are foreign nationals will be deported?
Mr. Speaker, we are clear that foreign criminals should be deported wherever possible. We will continue to do so. Mr. Speaker, this is in stark contrast to the calls to stop the deportation of foreign national criminals, those calls coming from the leader of the opposition and the party opposite. My honourable friend will please to know that FNO returns have increased by 19% in the last 12 months.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, my Slough constituents are often having to wait months to elicit a response for their asylum or Home Office queries. So, Home Secretary, given the Conservative government's persistent failure to effectively manage the asylum system, resulting in an almost 100,000 case backlog and the excessive use of expensive hotels, does he not feel that now is the time to adopt Labour's comprehensive plan, which would end the use of expensive hotels within 12 months and significantly reduce the backlog?
Minister.
I think he means the non-existent plan, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that last year we got on and made 112,000 initial decisions. If he has specific cases that he wishes to raise with me as the Minister, I am very happy to have a look at those. But the fact is the productivity improvements that we saw last year carries through a lot of learning as we now get on and we deal with the backlog. There's a lot of positive work that's gone on there. He should recognise that point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Humberside Police now have over 800 more officers than in 2010, which obviously enables them to provide a better service to my constituents, but also crucial is top-class leadership currently provided by Jonathan Everson, the Police Commissioner, and until recently Lee Freeman, the former Chief Constable, something I'm sure his successor will also provide. Would the Minister agree that top-class leadership is important, and what is he doing to ensure improvements to the present leadership training scheme?
Well, I join him in commending the progress Humberside Police have made, in particular under recent Chief Constable Lee Freeman. And in terms of improving leadership, of course, Lee Freeman is now one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and he can apply what he learned and then put into practice in Humberside across the whole country.
But the Chamberlain.
Mr. Speaker, on the 17th of October, the Government in the House pledged to make changes to ACRS Pathways 1 and 3. When can the House expect an update and a plan on this?
We, of course, are continuing to work very collaboratively across government in terms of the response to the situation in Afghanistan, fulfilling the commitments that we made to provide that sanctuary in the way that all of us want to see. We will come forward and say more about those efforts as soon as we're able.
Mr. Heard earlier about the effectiveness of the Safer Streets Fund, and Falmouth, in my constituency where most of the students live, recently received £67,000. In addition to that, our brilliant Police and Crime Commissioner Alison Hernandez has been working with Dawn Dines, who helped successfully change the law on spiking. But can my right honourable friend demonstrate to my Truro and Falmouth constituents how these positive changes will improve conviction rates in the Devon and Cornwall area?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for her question, and I congratulate her Police and Crime Commissioner for the excellent work that she's doing. She will be aware that we have amended the Offences Against the Person Act so that the offence of spiking is captured specifically and comprehensively in law, in part because we want more victims to come forward. But we are told time and again by the police that the most significant barrier to conviction is the length of time between the offence taking place and a toxicology report being received. Therefore, we are investing in rapid drink testing research so that we hope to bring the testing capacity on site.
Very much. UK Hospitality estimate that 95% of skilled worker visas that were gained last year would be lost under the new regulations. Now, that's a vital sector of my local economy in Edinburgh and for Scotland. So when will the government recognise that the revision to the salary level was not sufficient and bring it down to a reasonable level?
Well, I disagree with the honourable lady's interpretation of the situation. The fact is that we should be working in a collaborative cross-government way, particularly to support domestic employment wherever that is possible. There are comprehensive steps being taken through the Back to Work plan to help deliver on that, and there are many people here on other routes who are perfectly able to work and with the right support would be doing that, and that's precisely where we're going to focus our efforts.
Mr. Speaker, could I ask what steps my honourable friend is taking to provide advice
to police forces across the country to help them support communities during the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas?
Well, my honourable friend is right to ask this question because sadly we've seen an absolutely vile upsurge in anti-Semitism on our streets. We've seen people who claim to be speaking out for equality and justice actually defending people who take slaves, who violate women's and girls' rights, and here in our own country who make the Jewish community feel uncomfortable. That's exactly why this government has committed £18 million to the Community Safety Trust, and very sadly we've also had to commit £7 million to academic security. Sadly, there has been a massive increase in anti-Semitism in universities as well, and we are combating all of that.
Julian Lewis.
How many times must a demonstration in the same cause be repeated week in, week out, before the well-funded organisers become liable to pay for at least part of the policing costs?
Mr. Speaker, of course, we recognise that there is legitimacy to public protest. We do also recognise that the unprecedented and unwarranted pressure that this is putting on policing around the country is having an impact on communities. My view is that the organisers have made their point. Repeating it does not strengthen their argument, and unfortunately we're also seeing some deeply distasteful people weaving themselves in amongst those protesters who are protesting on issues that they feel passionate about but whose goodwill is being abused by others.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Home Secretary urgently meet with his right honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Braintree, he's Braintree, sorry, I can't remember the seat. Anyway, the member whose surname is Jenkin, to speak about why it is that when the whole House passed the Public Order Act with an amendment to have safe access zones for women using abortion clinics, it's now subject to consultation which would gut that legislation. Can you meet with us urgently? It's due on the 22nd of January, and it wouldn't actually do what all MPs from this House voted for.
I will endeavour to find out the details of the point the honourable lady made. She will write to me on this issue.
Final question, Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week the Home Secretary produced a report on safe and legal routes to comply with Section 61 of the Legal Migration Act and the amendment I tabled last year. It's very long and generous on the existing legal routes, but can he tell me how my 16-year-old orphan from a East African country with links to the UK, who is a genuine asylum seeker, will be helped to come legally and safely to the UK by what the government has published so far?
Well, my honourable friend is, of course, a very passionate advocate on this issue. We had a conversation last week about this very point. The fact is that since 2015, we've welcomed over 500,000 people through our safe and legal routes. We are introducing the cap precisely because we want to see that generosity extended in the years ahead, but the pressures of illegal migration in particular make that very, very challenging and very difficult. So this is precisely the sort of issue that I want to study with him as we move forward with the cap, to make sure that we do continue to help the most vulnerable people from around the world, working particularly with the UNHCR and others.
That completes questions. We now come to the statement. I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to update the House on the action that we took on Thursday night against Houthi military targets in Yemen. Since the 19th of November, Iran-backed Houthis have launched over 25 illegal and unacceptable attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. And on the 9th of January, they mounted a direct attack against British and American warships. They fired on our ships and our sailors. It was the biggest attack on the Royal Navy for decades. And so we acted. We did so in self-defence, consistent with the UN Charter, and to uphold freedom of navigation, as Britain has always done. Alongside the United States, with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, we ordered the RAF to strike 2 Houthi military facilities in Yemen. I want to be clear that these were limited strikes. They were carefully targeted at launch sites for drones and ballistic missiles to degrade the Houthis' capacity to make further attacks on international shipping. I can tell the House today that our initial assessment is that all 13 planned targets were destroyed. At the drone and cruise missile base in Barney, 9 buildings were successfully hit. A further 3 buildings were hit at Abs Airfield, along with a cruise missile launcher caught in the open. We have seen no evidence thus far of civilian casualties, which we took great care to avoid. I know the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the incredible bravery and professionalism of all our servicemen and women. The need to maximise the security and effectiveness of the operation meant that it was not possible to bring this matter to the House in advance. But we took care to brief members before the strikes took place, including you, of course, Mr. Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition, and I've come to the House at the earliest possible opportunity. Mr. Speaker, I do not take decisions on the use of force lightly. That's why I stress that this action was taken in self-defence. It was limited, not escalatory. It was a necessary and proportionate response to a direct threat to UK vessels and therefore to the UK itself. And Mr. Speaker, let me be absolutely clear why the Royal Navy is in the Red Sea. They are there as part of Operation Prosperity Guardian, protecting freedom of navigation as a fundamental tenet of international law. The Houthis' attack on international shipping have put innocent lives at risk. They have held 1 crew hostage for almost 2 months, and they are causing growing economic disruption. Global commerce cannot operate under such conditions. Containers and tankers are having to take a 5,000-mile detour around the Cape of Good Hope. That pushes up prices and imperils the passage of goods, foods and medicines that the British people and others rely on. We have attempted to resolve this through diplomacy. After numerous international calls for the attacks to stop, a coalition of countries gave the Houthis a clear and unambiguous warning 2 weeks ago. Last week, the UN Security Council passed a resolution condemning the attacks and highlighting the right of nations to defend their vessels and preserve freedom of navigation. Yet, the Houthis continued on their reckless path. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't fall for their malign narrative that this is about Israel and Gaza. They target ships from around the world. We continue to work towards a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza and to get more aid to civilians. We also continue to support a negotiated settlement in Yemen's civil war. But I want to be very clear that this action is completely unrelated to those issues. It is a direct response to the Houthis' attacks on international shipping. And we should also recognise the risks of inaction. It would weaken international security and the rule of law, further damage freedom of navigation in the global economy, and send a dangerous message that British vessels and British interests are fair game. And there is another point here, which is often overlooked. The Houthis' attack risks worsening the dire humanitarian situation in Yemen itself. The UK helps to feed around 100,000 Yemenis every month, with aid arriving via the very sea routes that the Houthis have in their sights. So, Mr. Speaker, the threats to shipping must cease. Illegally detained vessels and crews must be released, and we remain prepared to back our words with actions. But, Mr. Speaker, dealing with this threat does not detract from our other international commitments. Rather, it strengthens our determination to uphold fundamental UN principles. If our adversaries think that they can distract us from helping Ukraine by threatening international security elsewhere, they could not be more wrong. On Friday, I travelled to Kyiv to meet President Zelensky and address the Ukrainian parliament. I took a message from this House to the Rada that we will stand with Ukraine today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he won't stop there, and other malign actors will be emboldened. That's why Ukraine's security is our security. That's why the UK will stay the course. And it's why I'm confident that our partners share our resolve. And so far from our resolve faltering, our military support to Ukraine will increase this year. We will provide the single biggest package of defence aid to Ukraine since the war began, worth £2.5 billion. This will include more air defence equipment, more anti-tank weapons, more long-range missiles, thousands more rounds of ammunition and artillery shells, training for thousands more Ukrainian servicemen and women, and the single largest package of advanced drones given to Ukraine by any nation. All of this is on top of what we have already provided to support Ukraine. In total, since the war began, the United Kingdom will have provided almost £12 billion of aid to Ukraine. We were the first to train Ukrainian troops, first in Europe to provide lethal weapons, first to commit main battle tanks, first to provide long-range missiles, and now we are the first to keep the promise made at the last year's NATO summit, alongside 30 other countries, to provide new bilateral security commitments. Mr. Speaker, Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, and NATO will be stronger with Ukraine in it. But these commitments will help bridge the gap until that day comes. Under the new agreement that we signed with President Zelensky, we are building Ukraine's military capabilities, and if Russia ever invades Ukraine again, we will provide swift and sustained assistance, including modern equipment across land, air and sea. Together with our allies, the UK will be there from the first moment until the last. For all of this, Mr. Speaker, I bring a message of thanks from President Zelensky to the British people. And today I hope that this House will join me in sending a message back to the Ukrainian people that we stand together as one in support of these firm commitments. Yeah. We are building a new partnership with Ukraine, designed to last 100 years or more. Yes, it's about defence and security, but it's also about trade, investment, culture, and more. And there could be no more powerful sign of our unique bond than Ukraine's decision to adopt English as the language of business and diplomacy. And so through the British Council, we're going to fund English language training for the Ukrainian people. Yeah. So, Mr. Speaker, in dangerous times, we are investing in defence, hardening our critical infrastructure, building our alliances, and we are resolute in our principles. International security, the rule of law, and freedom to determine your own future. An attack on those principles is an attack on everything that we believe in and on which our lives and livelihoods depend. As the home of parliamentary democracy and a leader in collective security, it is our responsibility to defend those principles and to defend our people. That is who we are. That is what Britain does and will always do. And I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Prime Minister for the secure briefing last week and for advance copy of his statement. Mr. Speaker, let me reiterate that Labour backs this targeted action to reinforce maritime security in the Red Sea. We strongly condemn the Houthi attacks that are targeting commercial ships of all nationalities, putting civilians and military personnel in serious danger, including British forces. The Houthi attacks are unacceptable, illegal, and, if left unaddressed, could lead to a devastating rise in the cost of essential food in some of the poorest countries. And, Mr. Speaker, the international community clearly stands against the Houthi attacks. Alongside the UK and the US, 4 other countries were involved in non-operational support. Over a dozen nations are part of the Maritime Protection Force in the Red Sea, and many others support the recent UN Security Council resolution, which condemns the Houthi attacks in the strongest possible terms. The UK strikes were limited, targeted, and did everything possible to protect civilian lives. That is a proportionate response. Mr. Speaker, military action must, of course, always be underpinned by a clear strategy, and it's the role of this House to ask the right questions. So I ask the Prime Minister, What confidence does he have that his stated objectives have been met? What process will he follow in the face of continued Houthi attacks? What efforts are underway to maintain the support of the international community? And can he confirm that he stands by the Parliamentary Convention that, where possible, military interventions by the UK government, particularly if they're part of a sustained campaign, should be brought before this House? Scrutiny is not the enemy of strategy. Because while we back the action taken last week, these strikes still do bring risk. We must avoid escalation across the Middle East. So can the Prime Minister also tell us how the UK will work with international partners so that our rightful actions are not used as an excuse by those who seek to expand violence throughout the wider region, or indeed reanimate the conflict in Yemen itself? Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, our armed forces across the region are showing the highest professionalism and bravery, both in defending commercial shipping and this targeted action. We thank them, we are proud of them. They continue to show that Britain is a force for good. As does, Mr. Speaker, the UK's unwavering unity in support of Ukraine and against Russian aggression. On these benches, we have backed all military support. So again, we back the Prime Minister's announcement of £2.5 billion for Ukraine next year. And we strongly support the agreement on security cooperation. This will give Ukraine vital confidence to plan for the year ahead. I hope it becomes a template for other allies to follow, and that Ukraine, in time, will become a full member of NATO. Because, Mr. Speaker, to those listening in Kyiv, Moscow, or elsewhere in the world, let me be clear. Whoever is in government in Britain, the UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. Returning to the Middle East, it is now over 100 days since the brutal events of October the 7th. Israel's right to self-defence is fundamental, as is its duty to comply with international law. And the longer this conflict in Gaza rages, the more the risk of escalation throughout the entire region. On the Israel-Lebanon border, we must urge constraint. We must make it crystal clear to all parties that the UK does not support this conflict extending further in Lebanon. While within Israel and Palestine, in the West Bank, settler violence must stop immediately. And in Gaza, we need a humanitarian truce now, not as a short pause, but as the first step on a road away from violence. The need for a sustainable ceasefire is clear: to stop the killing of innocent civilians, to create the space for the return of all the hostages, and to provide urgent humanitarian relief, to protect against disease and ward off a devastating famine. Mr. Speaker, from that first step, we can begin a bigger push towards peace, a permanent end to the fighting, and a lasting political solution. The hope of the two-state solution is fragile, but it is still there, and we must fight for it, just as we must also remain resolute in the face of aggression which threatens global security, whether that's in Europe or the Red Sea. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his support of the action that we've taken? And I think he's absolutely right to highlight the international coalition that over recent weeks has called out the Houthis' behaviour, culminating in the UN Security Council resolution strongly condemning the attacks, which he rightly referenced. Our stated aim was to degrade and disrupt the Houthis' capability to launch attacks like this on civilian shipping. As I indicated, our initial assessment that those strikes that we conducted have been successful in the specific targets that were selected during the strikes. Obviously, that's an initial assessment, but that remains our case at the moment. And more generally, what we want to see is a reduction of tensions in the region and a restoration of stability. That is our stated aim. It's incumbent on the Houthis not to escalate this and continue with what are illegal and unprovoked attacks on civilian shipping, putting innocent lives at risk and damaging the global economy and the prices that British citizens and others will pay for their everyday goods, as the right honourable gentleman rightly pointed out. I can assure him that it was necessary to strike at speed, as he acknowledged, to protect the security of these operations. That is in accordance with the Convention, and I remain committed to that Convention and would always look to follow appropriate processes and procedures, and also act in line with precedent, where he will know there have been strikes in 2015 and 18 where a similar process as to this was followed. And I can also provide him with the assurance, as he rightly asked, about our international engagement, because there will be malign forces out there that seek to distort our action, to turn it into something that it is not, and it is important that we engage with our allies and those others in the region so they understand what we did and why. And I can provide him with the assurance that we have done that, will continue to do that, because it is important that there is no linkage between these actions and anything else that is happening. This is purely and simply to respond in self-defence to illegal attacks by the Houthis on commercial shipping. And I also welcome his support for the announcements we made with regard to Ukraine. He is again right to point out the importance of the security commitments that we have signed. 30 countries at the Vilnius summit promised to do so, and again this House should be proud that it's again the United Kingdom leading by being the first country to sign such a commitment, and which I now believe will serve as a template for others to follow. And I can tell him the enormous appreciation in Ukraine for the UK to do that, so that there is a long-term certainty for the Ukrainian people of our support, and providing further deterrence to Russia and others against future aggression. I think perhaps in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the confluence of these two events over the same 24 hours serves to highlight the increasing threats that we face as a country. The global environment is becoming more challenging, more unstable, and it is incumbent on us to respond to those challenges with increased investment in defence, as we are doing, strengthening our alliances, because ultimately we must defend the principles of international law, of freedom and democracy, freedom of navigation that we all hold dear, and this government will always stand ready to do that and to protect the British people.
Sir Julian Lewis.
The Prime Minister was clearly absolutely justified to respond as he did, particularly after the direct attack against HMS Diamond. But given that at the time of the Falklands campaign, we had 35 frigates and destroyers and were spending 4.5% of GDP on defence, whereas both those figures can be cut in half to describe our situation today, does he agree with me that we certainly should not be reducing the numbers of frigates or destroyers, and we certainly should not be mothballing or otherwise decommissioning our amphibious assault ships?
Prime Minister. Well, I'm happy to reassure my honourable friend that our intention is to increase defence spending from where it currently is up to 2.5% when the circumstances allow. It's worth reminding the House that we have consistently over the past decade been the second largest spender on defence in NATO, larger than 20 other countries combined, and our plans will continue to provide that leadership. Within that, there is a very strong equipment plan underpinned by the £24 billion extra that the MOD received in its most recent settlement, which for the Royal Navy does include Type 26, Type 31 and Type 32 frigates. And with regard to the specific vessels that he talked about, the Defence Secretary has asked the First Sea Law to plan how the Royal Marine's excellent work can be taken forward so that they have the capabilities that they need to continue their work and to be able to be deployed globally. And when that process concludes, of course, the Defence Secretary will update the House.
SNP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin by echoing the Prime Minister's sentiments in relation to Ukraine. All of us on these benches remain firmly united behind their struggle against Vladimir Putin's Russia. Mr. Speaker, when Sir Walter Scott wrote that in war both sides lose, I'm not quite sure he'd factored into the equation the likes of the Houthis, because they are, of course, the fundamentalists. And unperturbed by the bombing that they have been on the receiving end of from Saudi Arabia for many years, the perceived wisdom would suggest that they are perhaps not just content, but maybe even quite happy to be on the receiving end of American bombs. And it is in that context that that poses an enormous question for all of us in this House as to what comes next. If, as has been suggested through their actions over the course of the last 12 hours or so, the message which we sought to send has not been received, then what do we intend to do? What is the plan? What is the Prime Minister's strategy? Will he come to the dispatch box and, unlike his predecessors in relation to Middle East conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, lay out when and how far he is willing to go in relation to military action? Because quite clearly, we need to understand his government's strategy in this conflict, because we cannot have an escalation which leads to further regional instability. And of course, whilst we would all agree, quite rightly, that we should not fall for the Houthis' narratives that this is directly related to the conflict in Israel and Gaza, we cannot escape from the fact that a ceasefire in Gaza is essential for that wider regional stability. And finally, Mr. Speaker, whilst the Prime Minister has sought to defend his decision not to come to the House last week, it is quite clear that this House should have been recalled. It is what the public would have expected, and I would urge him to do better in future.
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments about Ukraine and support for our approach. With regard to the future, I obviously won't speculate on future action. What we conducted was intended as a single limited action, and of course we hope that the Houthis will now step back and end their reckless and destabilising attacks. But of course, Mr. Speaker, we will not hesitate to protect our security and our interests where required, and we would of course follow the correct procedures, as I believe we did so in this case. And although the honourable gentleman is right to ask questions, but we should also recognise the risks of inaction. Because doing nothing would absolutely weaken international security and the rule of law. It would further damage the freedom of navigation and the global economy. And perhaps most importantly, it would send a very dangerous message that British vessels and British interests are fair game, and that is simply unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, if I might say, and of course I'm happy to answer questions about the situation in Israel and Gaza, but this House should be very clear in making it clear to the outside world that there is no linkage between what we have done last week and the situation in Israel-Gaza. This was a specific action in self-defence against the Houthis, who are conducting illegal strikes against innocent civilian shipping, and that has nothing to do with what is going on in Israel-Gaza, and we must never let anyone think that this House believes that there is.
Richard Drax.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, for his excellent and wide-ranging speech this morning. He rightly pointed out that we face dangerous times. And can I ask my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, that while it's important how we spend defence money, it is vital and without doubt that defence needs a lot more money, more than 2.5% in these arbitrary targets, if our brave men and women are going to fight a sustained conflict in the years ahead.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree that the Defence Secretary did make an excellent speech earlier, and in that speech he highlighted, as I did, that defence spending has consistently met our NATO obligation. We've been the second largest defence spender in NATO, and in the last settlement, defence received the largest increase of £24 billion since the end of the Cold War, because my friend is right, the threats that we face are increasing. It's right that we invest to protect the British people against those threats, and that is exactly what this government is doing and will continue to do.
Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
While not having a vote in this House is regrettable, Liberal Democrats support limited strikes against the Houthis to open international shipping lanes. But we cannot lose sight, Mr. Speaker, of the fact this region is a tinderbox. Attacks on US soldiers in Syria and Iraq, the terrorism of Islamic State in Iran, the rockets of Hezbollah, the Israeli drone strikes in Beirut, all stemming from the horrifying conflict in Israel and Gaza. So can the Prime Minister set out what conversations he has had with our NATO and European allies, but also leaders of Gulf countries, to ensure that these limited strikes remain limited?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, as I said, we are extensively engaging with our international partners, including our Gulf allies. I recently spoke to the President of Egypt just last week and will continue to do so. But again, I say this, it's important that no one takes away that this House believes on any side that there is a linkage between direct action in self-defence against the Houthis and the situation in Israel-Gaza. They are entirely distinct. We will do everything we can to bring more aid into Gaza, to make sure that we work hard for a sustainable ceasefire, and that is separate to our ability and necessary duty to defend our interests and our people.
Sir Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister for his firm and principled response to events in the Red Sea? But with their support for Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis, is it not clear that Iran will do anything to stop lasting peace between Arab states and Israel, because the Iranian regime believes that Israel should not exist at all?
That's right.
Is not a real defeat for Iran to see them isolated by meaningful resolution of the Palestinian issue, the supercharging of the Abraham Accords process to bring peace and stability to the region, all underpinned by international resolve to confront Iran's proxies wherever they threaten our interests and our values?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his excellent remarks, but also for the work that he does on the Abraham Accords, which has done much to bring more peace and stability to the region. And he's right that the behaviour of the Iranian regime poses a significant threat to the safety and security of the UK and our allies, and ensures regional instability where we want to see more peace and stability. I can assure him that we are keeping abreast of all the risks in the area, and that's why the Royal Navy last year and the year before continues, for example, to interdict illegal arms smuggling by the Iranians to the Houthis, and we will continue to keep in close contact with our allies to take all measures that we can to protect our people and ensure that the Iranians' destabilising influence in the region is reduced to the best extent possible.
Priti Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and he's been absolutely crystal clear in the need to degrade the capabilities of this terrorist organisation, the Houthis, that are causing havoc in the Red Sea. He will also know that Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, suffering a mass humanitarian crisis with over 21 million people in need of humanitarian need and support. Can I ask the Prime Minister, what will he do to ensure that they are not engulfed all over again, particularly the civilians of Yemen, in a mass humanitarian catastrophe?
Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising an incredibly important point and reassure her in the House that, and she will know this from her own experience, that we are steadfast in our support to the Yemeni people as one of the largest donors of life-saving aid to the UN appeal. We've also committing, I believe, £88 million in this forthcoming year. Over the last several years, we've committed £1 billion, and that will help to providing food for at least 100,000 people every month and deliver life-saving healthcare through 400 facilities. The Yemeni people are suffering, and we're doing everything we can to alleviate that suffering.
John Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this century, with the threats of access to the Suez Canal from Somali piracy, the international community united with a widely based task force to successfully suppress it. Now the Houthis are threatening the lives of seafarers and international navigation, trade and the jobs that depend on it. Will he also seek to work to get the widest possible international task force to deal with this? And will he also support the people of South Yemen who want nothing to do with these terrorists?
Minister. Oh, the honourable gentleman is right about the necessity of building international coalitions. I'm pleased to say that is happening. Operation Prosperity Guardian, which we are proud to be a partner of, is upholding freedom of navigation in the region. As has been mentioned as well, the UN Security Council resolution that was passed on the 10th of January, I think, is instructive in this sense. It very strongly condemns, as it condemns in the strongest terms, the Houthi attacks, demands that they immediately cease all attacks, and notes the right of member states to act in accordance with international law to defend their vessels. He will also have seen the statement published by around a dozen of our allies before and after the strikes, and that will hopefully reassure him that there is broad international support for what we are doing and calls on the Houthis to desist what they are doing.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
I represent a constituency with a proud maritime tradition, and families are anxious for commercial shipping staff whose jobs take them through the Red Sea. A scramble towards military action is endangering UK seafarers in the Red Sea. Maritime unions are calling for not just more protection, but they stress the need for coordinated diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis. After today's attack on a ship, can he explain to seafarers how dropping bombs will lead to a de-escalation of a situation which is already endangering their safety?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's quite extraordinary. It is Houthi rockets that are endangering the lives of British seafarers in the region. And actually, what we have seen, as you've seen from shipping companies who have welcomed the action that we have taken, because they are keen to see security and stability restored to the region, and that is what we are aiming to do. To disrupt and destabilise the Houthis' ability and degrade their ability to carry out these attacks, restore stability to the region. That is very much the focus of our attention. We're acting in self-defence to protect the lives of seafarers, not endanger them, and she would do well to call out the Houthis to stop what they're doing.
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the international law case for the action his government has taken in the Red Sea was, unusually in my experience, relatively straightforward? But would he also agree that the next significant challenge is to maintain and enhance a multinational consensus in deterring and combating more of these attacks if they occur? And would he accept that acting in compliance with and respectful of international law assists us in that task?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he is right, and hopefully he will have seen the published legal summary of our advice on this issue. This was proportionate and necessary action taken lawfully to respond to attacks by the Houthis, and they were the only feasible means to do so. And the UK is, as he knows, permitted under international law to use force in such circumstances. It's right that we have regard for the legal advice in such situations, and I can reassure him that we will continue to always have regard to it. While we are fighting to protect international law, it's important that we also follow it ourselves.
Amsana Begum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 71% of the British public want a ceasefire in Israel-Gaza. That's according to a latest YouGov poll taken just last month. Yet last week, the government launched airstrikes in the Red Sea, an escalation of the situation in the Middle East. I understand that the government may not have been under any constitutional obligation to take a parliamentary vote on this particular military action, or indeed abide by a result of that vote, should it have even decided to take one. But does the Prime Minister believe he has any duty towards, the government has any duty towards the British public when making such decisions, and to the parliamentary community who represent the British people in building any political support for this military action?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition made the point in his remarks, rightly, that we need to make sure that malign actors elsewhere would not try and distort what we have done for their own purposes. But I would gently say to the Honourable Lady to conflate and link our action against the Houthis with the situation in Israel-Gaza just gives ammunition to our enemies who would seek to make things worse in the region. We have acted in self-defence. I've explained the reasons and the processes that we have followed and the accountability that I have to Parliament, which I am now here discharging. And separately, we will of course work very hard to bring humanitarian aid into Gaza and to try and bring about the sustainable ceasefire that we all, of course, want to see.
Sir Bachelor.
I commend my right honourable friend for prosecuting this military action. As a matter of law, it was highly necessary and clearly proportionate, and his legal position is watertight. Countries around the world depend on that route, but as usual it is the British and Americans who do something about protecting it. There are reports, however, this afternoon that more Houthi attacks are taking place. Will he take more military action if necessary?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his support. Of course, he'll understand that I won't speculate on future action. This was intended as limited single action, and we hope the Houthis will now step back and end their destabilising attacks. But of course, as I said earlier, we will not hesitate to protect our security, our people and our interests where required. And if we do so, we will of course follow the correct procedures and precedent as we did in this case.
Sir Christopher Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right that Ukraine needs military support, but it also needs to be rebuilt. Last year, the government, the British government that is, opposed proposals that we should seize Russian state assets, $300 billion worth, sitting in banks around the world, including in the UK, and use them to rebuild Ukraine. The Foreign Secretary, however, I note in December in the United States of America said that he was now arguing that we should be able to seize those assets. Shouldn't we legislate to make sure that Putin pays for the reconstruction of Ukraine?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not entirely sure that I agree with the characterisation of the situation by the honourable gentleman. I agree that Russia must pay for the long-term reconstruction of Ukraine, and I've been clear about that. And actually, on the G7 leaders' call at the end of last year, I was the one who raised this issue, and as a result, we have collectively in the G7 tasked finance ministers to explore all lawful routes to ensure that Russian assets are made available for that purpose. We're working to identify all options for seizing those assets. We're doing it at pace and ensuring that those measures would be safe, robust and compliant with the international rule of law, and we are doing it in conjunction with our international allies. So I can give him all those reassurances, and again it's the UK together with the US who has been leading that conversation in the G7.
Jeremy Quinn.
Houthi attacks on shipping are a global problem, and it's right that we acted alongside our partners. Where close allies did not participate in those airstrikes, we still need them to act and act alongside us. Can we encourage them to redouble their efforts to interdict arms smuggling from Iran into Yemen, and therefore help to degrade further the military capacity of the Houthis?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and we will continue to work with our allies, and hopefully he will have seen the statement that was put out by around a dozen of our allies after the strikes, reiterating their support for what we have done, and he'll know that there was non-operational support from a handful of other countries, together with the much larger coalition of nations that are involved in different ways in Operation Prosperity Guardian, where other countries can play a part in interdicting Iranian shipments and bringing stability to the region and protecting international shipping. We of course want to work with them, and the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary are having those conversations as we speak.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We live in most challenging times with instability in the Middle East, in Europe and indeed in Africa, and it's important that we have the right kind of leadership and response. We must make sure that our international shipping routes remain open. Can I ask the Prime Minister of his assessment of the degradation of the Houthis' capabilities after the action last week? And when it comes to Ukraine, we must stand united in this House that the Russians must be defeated for the aggression that they've shown, and we should remain together, united in saying once again, Slavia, Ukraine. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister talks about a sustainable settlement in Gaza. It is important that we recognise the scale of the humanitarian suffering. So can I ask the Prime Minister for an update of what we're doing to make sure that in Gaza that we deliver peace and security, and we have the hope of a better world as we come through 2024?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable gentleman for his support of the action in Ukraine, and maybe I'll just touch on his last point, in fact, because I agree with him. We're of course concerned about the devastating impact of the conflict in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives already, and there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support into Gaza. I'm pleased that the UK is playing a leading role. We've tripled our aid. Recently, the Foreign Secretary appointed a humanitarian envoy into the region to address some of the blockages, and just recently we delivered our first maritime shipment of aid into Egypt, over 80 tons of new aid. And when I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I impressed upon him obviously the importance of increasing the flow of trucks, but crucially, if we can, to open up extra crossings into Gaza so we can increase the flow of aid. We will continue to press on Israel to do that so we can bring more relief to people who are suffering a great deal.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Prime Minister for a very clear statement. It is reported that the drones being used by the Houthis are being helped by Iran. And the American Enterprise Institute has reported that Russia has given $900 million to Iran for drones. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that we are doing everything we possibly can in this country to make sure that none of this money is going through the UK financial system?
I can tell the Iran lady that she's right, and we agree with the US assessment that Iran has directly supplied and directly supported Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, providing intelligence especially to enable their targeting of vessels and providing them with missiles and UAVs. She's right that we should do everything we can to prevent that, and I can reassure her, of course, she'll know about the financial measures we've taken over the past 2 years to ensure things like transparency, beneficial ownership registers, which allow us to crack down on economic crime and money laundering, but also physically, the Royal Navy is involved in interdicting those shipments and has successfully done so last year and the year before, and will continue to have a presence in the region so we can disrupt those illegal arms flows.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, it's a critical time internationally, but we have a staffing crisis in our Navy. So can we do more to boost recruitment of sailors with STEM qualifications, and when will we see our Navy back up to full strength?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would say our Royal Navy is one of the top 5 in the world. It's capable of operating in all of the world's oceans simultaneously, and is one of only 2 countries to provide, or that has been proven to operate 5th-generation jets from the sea. So no, I think we should be confident and proud of our Royal Navy. As I've talked about, we're investing in more equipment and capability going into the future. He's right to highlight some of the recruitment challenges, and the Defence Secretary highlighted these the other week, but we are doubling down on all the initiatives we had to make sure that all our armed forces have the staff that they need and the personnel they need for the future, but also that those personnel have the equipment and supplies they need in order to do their job effectively.
Ian Duncan, Sir Ian Duncan Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I fully support my right honourable friend and welcome his statement about the action he took on the Houthi and the other statement, part of the statement about Ukraine. We must support Ukraine in their future. But can I just bring back to the reality about the Houthi? Iran, we know, has supported, supplied and continues to direct the Houthi in their attacks. We know that Iran has supported and directed Hamas in their brutal attacks in October. We know that Iran has armed and directs Hezbollah on a regular basis and tells them what to do through the IRGC. And all of that we understand. But can I ask my right honourable friend why it is we still are reluctant to prescribe the IRGC, who are responsible for so much of the coordination of this work, and we still sit with 2 Iranian banks in the City of London feeding their money across to these terrible organisations?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend particularly for the work he personally does in supporting Ukraine, and I agree with him about the risk that Iran poses to both UK but also regional stability. We have sanctioned more than 400 Iranian individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety. I'd also say that the National Security Act of last year implements new measures to protect the British public. It's been described by intelligence chiefs as game-changing, particularly tackling espionage and foreign interference with tougher powers to arrest and detain people suspected of involvement in state threats. And he will know we don't routinely comment on prescription, but he will have, I hope, seen the statement today about our prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is something that I know he and other colleagues have been focused on rightly in the previous years.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Prime Minister this? In that region, there are 17 million people living in hunger and food shortage. We've had years of bombardment of the people of Yemen by weapons supplied by Britain from Saudi Arabia. And we have this dreadful conflict going on in Gaza where there are 30,000 people dead or missing. Where is the comprehensive plan by the Western nations to try to bring about a comprehensive peace across the whole region, rather than pumping more and more weapons and money in to more and more conflicts, which will get worse? Does he have any hope for the future that there will be a lessening of conflict rather than the present very rapid increase in it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do have hope, and that's because as we and others take action to degrade and disrupt the capability of those who are malign actors in the region, that will actually give the space for positive voices to build the peace that all of us want to see and to allow everyone to live side by side with dignity and security and opportunity. The original pointed out some of the humanitarian strife that people are suffering. As I pointed out, we should be proud in this House of our record. We have committed over £1 billion of aid in Yemen since the conflict began in 2014. As I said, we are currently providing food to at least 100,000 people every month, life-saving healthcare to 400 facilities. And it's worth pointing out that Yemen is entirely reliant for food on imports largely by sea. And the Houthis' attacks are actually serving to prolong the humanitarian suffering that Yemeni people are seeing. It's disrupting the very supply of the food that both he and I and everyone in this House would want to see delivered to those people.
Blake Drummond.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and Yemen's been close to my heart, as it has been for the Right Honourable Member for Walsall South, as we were both born there. Thank you very much for all the humanitarian aid that is going there. But I would like to ask what discussions the Prime Minister has had with the Yemeni Presidential Leadership Council, and what impact does he think the strikes will have on the fragile peace process?
Prime Minister.
Can I pay tribute to my honourable friend's work in the region? As the United Nations Security Council penholder on Yemen, the UK is continuing to use our diplomatic and political influence to support UN efforts to bring lasting peace to Yemen through an inclusive political settlement. We support the Saudi-Houthi negotiations and indeed the deal that was announced in December of last year by the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, who she will know. And ministers continue to be in dialogue, particularly with our Saudi partners, so that we can try and bring the peace and stability to the Yemeni people that they deserve.
Lynn Brown.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister also for stating today that the UK sought to uphold international law and seek to protect civilians with the recent strikes. Can I ask what the government's strategy is to prevent escalation? And also last week, the government confirmed that there are currently no RAF aid flights or Royal Navy deliveries planned to take essential aid into Egypt and onwards to Gaza. Why?
Prime Minister.
I'm not entirely sure that that's right, and I can say to the Honourable Lady we remain committed to increasing the amount of aid that we get into Gaza. We've tripled the financial amount, and as I said, most recently we saw our first maritime shipment of aid into Egypt, where a UK military ship, RAF Lyme Bay, was able to deliver that. We know, and she will be aware, that there are considerable blockages and logistical challenges on the ground, which we are working to help resolve, which is also why we're putting pressure on the Israelis. I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu about this, about opening up additional crossings like Kerem Shalom, so that would help us increase the flow of aid into the region. We absolutely want to see that happen.
Charlotte Sholbrook.
Mr. Speaker. Britain does have a very proud tradition of defending waterways, and does
my right honourable friend agree with me that actually for all of us who care about humanitarian crisis and aid, that with Russia's action in stopping grain as much as it can coming out of Turkey, past Turkey, and the potential of the Houthis shutting off the access into the Red Sea, that is absolutely vital that we keep these international waterways open, otherwise we will be facing a catastrophic situation of starvation across many African countries.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point, and particularly about the Black Sea. He'll recall that Ukraine's grain exports disproportionately go to some of the most vulnerable countries in the world. Russia has started a campaign of targeting that civilian infrastructure last year. With our support, they have now able to push back the Black Sea fleet, degrade Russia's major combatant vessels, and again, with the support of the City of London in improving the insurance of those ships, we have now seen 300 ships export 10 million tonnes of cargo through the new Ukraine corridor. It highlights the importance of what he's saying, and again, in this House, we should be proud of the leading role that the UK has had in making that possible.
Alex Davis-Jones.
The Houthis are an anti-Semitic terrorist group that have caused havoc in Yemen over the past decade, starting a civil war that has killed over 350,000 people. Its slogan includes the lines, "Death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews." Would the Prime Minister join me in condemning the shameful pro-Houthi chanting that we saw at many protests in the UK over the weekend?
Can I commend the Honourable Lady for her remarks, and can I wholeheartedly agree with her. We will absolutely not tolerate that kind of language on our streets. We have been crystal clear about that. We have said to the police that they should take all decisive action against those that promote and encourage terrorism, and indeed those that incite hatred and division on our streets. She will have, I hope, seen the prescription of Hizb ut-Tahrir today, another organisation which uses language similar to what she says. They absolutely, their promotion of terrorism is rooted in anti-Semitic ideology. I hope that gives her reassurance that we will confront this and stamp it out wherever we see it, because it's not in accordance with British values, and Jewish people in this country deserve to be able to walk our streets in freedom and security.
Sir Bernard Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's decision last week to take military action in the Red Sea, and also the substantial increase in aid for Ukraine. But could he just take this opportunity to reiterate and make it absolutely clear it would be utterly against the national interest and indeed the security interests of the world for the British Prime Minister to be hobbled in the decisions he makes about taking military action by the need to consult in advance? Does he not agree that that responsibility that he bears is intrinsic to his seals of office and it should not be given up?
Minister.
I'll thank my honourable friend for his comments, and in this case it was necessary to strike with speed and protect the security of the operations, and I believe that is in accordance with the Convention and indeed precedent on these matters, and I believe that he's right. The government does need to protect the security and interests of the United Kingdom. That means sometimes you do have to act decisively, quickly and securely, and fundamentally we need to maintain the prerogative powers that allow the executive to act in such emergencies. But of course, I am responsible for those decisions. I do not take them lightly, and Parliament is responsible for holding me to account for them.
Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Past mistakes in the Middle East should have taught this House that military intervention starting out as limited can quickly escalate, risking a sequence of events far larger and more terrible, and risk even dragging us into war. It is for this reason, according to reports in the Times, that Foreign Office officials were, and I quote, incredibly nervous about last week's military assault in Yemen. Driving the region's instability is Israel's horrifying assault on Gaza, which has now lasted more than 100 days. So rather than giving Israel the green light to continue its brutal bombardment of Gaza and risking a wider conflict, will the Prime Minister seek to de-escalate the situation and call for an immediate ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Perhaps the Honourable Lady would do well to call on Hamas and the Houthis to de-escalate the situation.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Too many people give a free pass to the terrorists who
who perpetrated the worst murder of Jews, and we've just seen an example of that, just as we saw examples of that on our streets this weekend, where people screamed, "Yemen, Yemen, turn another ship around." Completely unacceptable. One thing that links the Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas is their genocidal intent toward Jews and their hatred of everything we stand for in the Western democracies, which is why it is incumbent upon us to defend those values. So can I agree with everything the Prime Minister has said, and can I urge him once more to make sure our police are taking action against those who on our street openly support terrorism?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I reassure my honourable friend that the police do have extensive powers to arrest those who incite violence or racial hatred. Of course, we keep all laws under review. We're working with the police whether we need to strengthen those powers, but I've been absolutely clear that there must be zero tolerance for anti-Semitism and any forms of racism. We will not stand by when we see that happen, and the police should make sure that those who do that face the full force of the law.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary said yesterday that the purpose of the airstrikes in Yemen was to send a message. But the message that we intend to send isn't necessarily the message that gets received. And the message seems to have been sent to many in the region that the UK is intervening in the war very clearly on the side of Israel. So what plans does the government have to manage and contain the escalation that is likely to ensue? Because simply proclaiming that this activity was intended to be limited, not escalatory, does not make it so.
And that's why we took this action as a last resort after extensive attempts at diplomacy, including a UN Security Council resolution. And again, the Honourable Lady could help, because this Parliament can speak with one voice that the outside world and our allies in the region know that this does have nothing to do with Israel and Gaza and has everything to do with our self-defence.
Sarah Atherton.
Speaker, diverting shipping via the Cape is a financial burden for us all, no more so than the Egyptians due to reduced traffic through the Suez Canal. So can my right honourable friend explain what discussions he's had with his Egyptian counterparts over their involvement in this multinational response?
Prime Minister.
Well, I spoke to President Sisi just last week. She's right to highlight the economic impact on people around the world. 15% of global trade passes through this corridor, and we are already starting to see the impact of rerouting on the prices of shipping and ultimately on the prices that British people will pay for their goods. My primary conversation with the President at the moment, though, is about increasing the flow of aid into Gaza, where Egypt is doing an extraordinary amount, and we will continue to give them every support that they need.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said that the stated aims of this action was to degrade the capacity to strike. We have had confirmation that today another cargo ship, a US cargo ship, has been struck by a ballistic missile. There have been explosions at the Yemeni port of Hodeidah. The Defence Secretary told the media this morning that this government was prepared to take the decisions that need to be taken if the attacks continue. Given this news that the attacks have continued, can the Prime Minister set out for us what those decisions are and how he intends to involve Parliament in that process?
Mr. Speaker, it wouldn't be right to speculate on future action, but what I can say is our strikes were intended to degrade the Houthi capability, and as I said, they did, initial assessments show, effectively destroy 13 targets at 2 sites, including drones, an airfield and a cruise missile launcher.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, as co-chair of the all-party Yemen group with my honourable friend from Meon Valley, we've seen at first hand how this brutal, misogynistic, homophobic, anti-Semitic terrorist regime backed by Iran, presiding over the world's greatest humanitarian crisis and responsible for throwing tens of thousands of young men to their deaths in the front line, have acted. Since 2022, they've benefited from a tentative ceasefire. So is this not a lesson in how you cannot achieve sustainable ceasefires with terrorist organisations unless and until they have been deprived of their arms and succumbed to democratic legitimacy?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank and pay tribute to my honourable friend's work in Yemen and very simply agree with him and say that he makes an excellent point.
John MacDonald.
I appreciate why the Prime Minister's not trying to link this to Gaza, but the reality is the longer the Gaza war goes on, the greater the instability in the Middle East will take place. It's nearly 100 days since he gave his first statement after the terrible horrendous actions by Hamas. And he justified the actions this week with regard to protection of maritime rights. In that 100 days, 7,000 Palestinian children have been killed. What effective action is he taking to protect the right to life of Palestinian children? And what effective action is he taking to prevent what is in reality the indiscriminate killing of Palestinian children by the Israeli Defence Force?
Hear, hear. Prime Minister. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I said, we are deeply concerned about the devastating impact of the fighting in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives already, and that is why we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and for civilians to be protected. It's something that I continually raise with Prime Minister Netanyahu when I speak to him, and it is why we're doing absolutely everything we can to get more aid into Gaza to help those children and everyone else affected by what is happening.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could I very much welcome this robust statement, but also agree with proscribing the IRGC. Operationally, given the continued threat to international shipping and by extension to our own economy, will he consider tasking the carrier group, which is ready to deploy from Portsmouth to the Gulf? And more strategically, does he agree that interruption to our global supply chains underlines the symbiotic relationship between our security and the UK economy? If we are rightly to seek to play a greater role in upholding international law as our world becomes ever more contested, we do need to expedite upgrading our defence posture, not least in the maritime space.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very good point about the interconnectedness of the world, the instability that we see, whether it's in the Red Sea or indeed the illegal war conducted in Ukraine by Russia, have had a direct impact on the economic security of British people here at home. That's why it's right that we invest in defence, protect people, and that's why I know he will continue to engage in dialogue with the Defence Secretary at how best to deploy that extra defence investment to make sure that we have the capabilities that we need.
Order. If everybody could resume their seats. We've already done an hour, and it looks to me as if there's still a considerable number of people who want to get in. So please can I ask you to focus on shorter questions in order that I can help you to get in.
Thank you very much.
Brendan O'Hara.
Deputy Speaker, the right of innocent passage is a fundamental principle of international law, and it cannot be interrupted by non-state actors. And although he may wish it wasn't the case, international law isn't a menu. It comes as a package, and we cannot pick and choose what bits we want to uphold and what bits we want to ignore. So the Prime Minister unable to see how ignoring Israel's egregious breaches in Gaza, while purporting to act in defence of it in Yemen, actually undermines international law and the rules-based order.
No, Mr. Speaker. Israel has the right to act in self-defence against Hamas, which conducted a terrorist attack on them, and we continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and for civilians to be protected in that conflict.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this House should be in no doubt that conflating issues relating to Israel and Hamas is not a mature way to look at the problem that the Prime Minister had to look at last week. He's made the right decision on the evidence in accordance with law. The question would have been, had he failed to take that action, then he would be, I think, exposed to justifiable criticism in this House. In light of that approach that he's taking, with regard to Ukraine, and the work that we are doing to work with the Ukrainian government, will more be done to make sure that we can help our friends in Ukraine develop further their justice processes, which I think will, in the long term, improve the good governance of that independent country.
Prime Minister. Can I thank my honourable friend? He makes an excellent point, and I'm pleased to tell him that the Attorney General is deeply involved in the work that he suggests, and we're particularly supporting the work of the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, but more generally the agreement that I just signed with President Zelensky ensures our mutual commitment to help him reform the administration and public administration in Ukraine, something that he's passionate and keen to do, and he will have our support in doing so.
Stephen Doty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has heard the support for limited targeted action against the Houthis. And I know when I listened carefully to what he said about the efforts to prevent civilian casualties, which was unfortunately an issue I had to raise many times in relation to the previous conflict in Yemen. But can he say, therefore, a bit more about what we are practically doing to ensure they are tightly targeted against Houthi military capabilities? And, of course, he rightly made the point about that those are being done to protect civilian shipping. But could he say a little bit more what we're doing to prevent civilian casualties?
Minister.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, we obviously, the Honourable Gentleman will respect that we don't comment in depth on the choice of targets. We do use carefully calibrated intelligence in conjunction with our military partners. The targets were selected specifically to degrade military capabilities. They're narrowly focused on taking out military hardware, which can be used to attack commercial shipping. And I can give them the reassurance that every effort was made to minimise civilian casualties, and indeed our initial assessment says that that has been successful.
Raymond Shishti.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Foreign Secretary said over the weekend that the world is in the most dangerous position it has been in decades. The UK has seen military deployments in Ukraine, Kosovo, Guyana, now the Red Sea. It is absolutely crucial to ensure that our armed forces have the appropriate support and resources they need. The Prime Minister has said the government is committed to an aspiration of 2.5% spending on defence. An aspiration. When does the Prime Minister see that aspiration becoming a reality? And will the government now further look at increasing that to 3% in line with the Foreign Secretary's statement over the weekend that the world is in the most dangerous situation it has been in decades?
Mr. Speaker, we have been investing in anticipation that the threats were increasing, and that's why at the last spending review the Defence Department received a £24 billion cash increase, the largest sustained increase since the end of the Cold War. Since then, we've invested an extra £5 billion in increasing stockpiles and in improving the sustainability of our nuclear defence nuclear enterprise. And in 2025, when we have the next spending review, we will, of course, set out the target and the path towards 2.5%.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister very much for his statement, and assure the Prime Minister that the Democratic Unionist Party will stand with him and with our government in sending the clear message to those who would seek to attack either our shipping routes or only attacking our position. We will not be silenced by those who believe they can work in the shadows to supply Yemen or indeed any other country with intelligence or arms. Will the Prime Minister affirm that the friendship and approach between the United Kingdom, United States of America, Australia, Canada and many other nations remain strong enough to stand together against any attempt to undermine our current position? Thank you.
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his support, and he's right about the importance of working with our allies, and he will have seen, I think, all the countries he mentioned as joint signatories of the statement that was put out in advance and after the strikes.
Sir Edward Lee.
Of course we have a right to defend ourselves, and of course sinister forces such as the Houthis in Iran are exploiting these tensions. But just as we have influence on the Americans because we step up to the mark, can my right honourable friend work with the American President to ensure that just as he is completely vigorous in defending Israel and their right to exist, he is even as vigorous in defending the right of the Palestinian people to their own state in peace and justice without a settlement being imposed on them every week?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that we do want to see the long-term future of a two-state solution where Palestinian and Israeli people can live side by side in security, in freedom and with dignity and opportunity. That is the future that we're all striving for, and the events of the last few months have just reminded us that we need to double our efforts on making that happen.
Nick Whitley.
Thank you. I regard with the utmost seriousness the threat posed by Houthi forces to mariners in the Red Sea. But does the Prime Minister accept that upholding the right to freedom of navigation in the region is an international challenge that should be dealt with through international diplomacy, principally aimed at securing a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza, and that by joining in US-led military action without reference to the UN, we're in danger of exacerbating the threat posed to British citizens by terrorism?
Again, the honourable gentleman has wrongly linked and conflated the situation in Israel and Gaza with the illegal attacks by the Houthis on innocent commercial shipping. That is simply wrong. And as I pointed out in my statement, there had been extensive diplomatic avenues pursued before military action was taken as a last resort, including a UN Security Council resolution.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister upon his action? He's acted clearly upon robust legal advice, and the legal position in international law is surely clear. Would he agree that A, it is unhelpful and frankly dangerous to make bogus comparisons, and secondly, to recognise that going forward, the greatest risk of escalation will be to fail to act robustly when clear and egregious breaches of international law take place.
Can I thank my honourable friend? I agree with everything he said, and he's absolutely right that there is a risk in inaction, and to have done nothing in the face of these attacks would have been to damage the security of our people and our interests.
Boone Thompson.
I welcome the Prime Minister's commitment to protecting fundamental tenets of international law and upholding fundamental principles of United Nations. But could I ask the Prime Minister, is that as equally distinct and limited to this action as it is to all other situations?
Prime Minister.
Again, so I didn't completely follow what the honourable gentleman was saying, but I said our actions in this case were specific to the case at hand. We acted in self-defence because there was escalating attacks from the Houthis, and defiance of international diplomacy, it was right that we took action to protect the security and interests of our people.
Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, given the global shortage of basic ammunition, artillery rounds and air defence systems and missiles, isn't it time that we really upscaled our industrial defence capacity so we can continue to support our friends in Ukraine and replenish our own stocks?
Excellent point. In a word, yes. That's why we've invested $2.5 billion in rebuilding our stockpiles. But beyond the money, we do need to actually just build our defence industrial capability. This is a shared challenge across NATO, something that I've extensively discussed with partners, including the NATO Secretary General. But of course, part of our agreement with Ukraine is how we can mutually help support and grow our defence industrial complexes.
I'm Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable, with well over 20,000 children and innocent civilians already killed by Israeli forces, more than 100 Israeli hostages still held by Hamas, and the real risk of an escalating wider regional conflict. We desperately need an end to the violence. So can the Prime Minister explain exactly what diplomatic progress he has achieved towards securing a sustainable ceasefire and peace in Gaza?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for, I think, being the first member opposite to actually remind the House that Hamas still holds 100 Israeli hostages. And it's good that he pointed that out. And he's right, we are continuing to do everything we can to bring about that sustainable ceasefire, whether it's working with the Qataris and others to secure the release of hostages and put more aid into Gaza, because I want to see what he wants to see. No one wants to see this conflict go on for a moment longer. It must be a sustainable ceasefire, and that's what we will work hard to bring about.
Stephen Crabb.
Deputy Speaker, the IAEA recently confirmed that Iran is once again ramping up its uranium enrichment activities and to near weapons grade. So in welcoming today's statement and the action that we've taken, can I urge my right honourable friend to give the House his assurance that he and his counterparts amongst our allies aren't losing sight of the really big question about whether Iran should be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, and whether he's considered whether it's the right time to activate the snapback sanctions provisions of the JCPOA.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. To say to my right honourable friend, there is absolutely no credible civilian justification for enrichment at the levels that the IAEA has reported in Iran. We are determined that Iran must not develop a nuclear weapon, and we are actively considering next steps with our international partners. That means all diplomatic tools, but including, as he said, using the snapback mechanism if necessary.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We all stand behind Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, but does the Prime Minister accept that if we believe that the UK's security is important in relation to Ukraine, that we do accept that we are giving relatively less than other countries such as Germany? Can and should we be doing more?
So we should be proud of our record. We've been one of the largest contributors to the effort in Ukraine. But it's also important to recognise that we have consistently been the first country to act, and that has galvanised others. And that is an important role that Ukrainians especially recognise. I went through the capabilities that was true for, but again, crucially, we were the first country out of the 30 that promised to sign a security commitment. And as others follow, that will enhance and improve Ukraine's deterrent against Russia. And again, it's something that we should be proud of.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister here opening himself up to democratic scrutiny, but can I also welcome the fact that he took the decision to act and took that heavy duty and responsibility before coming to this House, and it is folly to ask for a vote in advance of action, and it is in our national security that the Prime Minister can act, and that precedent goes a long way back, well before 2015 and 2018, the precedents he cites, but is the constitutional basis on which we defend ourselves as a country.
Prime Minister. Can I thank my honourable friend for his support and his comments? And he's right, this is not a decision that I took lightly, and he was right to point out that publicising an action like this in advance could undermine the effectiveness of it and risk the lives. Of course, it's Parliament's responsibility to hold me to account for such decisions, but it is my responsibility as Prime Minister to make those decisions.
Harry Sherman.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister may not be aware that, or perhaps he is aware that I am not the greatest expert on international relations, but I am a person that was born on August the 17th, 1940, when the German bombers were falling all over and I was sheltering in a shelter. And can I tell him that although I've been a Labour friend of Israel ever since I went to the London School of Economics, I don't trust Netanyahu's government, although I do support the limited action that he has announced. But could I say, as someone who was born in the Blitz, that I care very deeply about actions that might lead to an even greater conflagration in the Middle East. That is the danger. It seems to me is exactly what Putin and Iran wants. And please, let's be careful in these steps, although I do support the limited action.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments and reassure him that the action we took, I believe, was necessary, but it was limited and proportionate and in keeping with international law, and that's the approach that we will always take in such matters.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I was proud to celebrate Christmas and New Year with Huddersfield and Colne Valley's vibrant Ukrainian community once again this year, just as I have done for many years. And they told me firsthand how proud and appreciative they are of the UK's steadfast support for Ukraine. Will the Prime Minister continue to make the case not only to the British people, but to our NATO allies and international allies, why we must make sure, alongside Ukraine, that Putin's evil aggression doesn't succeed, and just remind people of what the dire consequences would be if he ever did?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. If Putin was to succeed, it would not just embolden him, but it will embolden our adversaries around the world. And that's why it's important that we continue to invest in Ukraine. And as I say to all our allies, an investment in Ukraine's security is ultimately an investment in our security. And that's why we must stand with them for as long as it takes.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Government of Japan clearly brought the resolution to the UN last week for specific reasons, and it's a very detailed resolution which was voted on. And one part of it, which they think is extremely important, of course, is part which, quote, is to deal with the root causes of the conflict in relation to Yemen. So maybe can I give the Prime Minister the opportunity to reflect again on the question posed by my honourable friend, the member for Aberdeen South. What is the government's plan now to play a part in the ending of that conflict? What comes next?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I said previously, we are supportive of the Saudi-Houthi negotiations, of the deal that was announced in December by the UN Special Envoy. We've been in dialogue specifically with the Saudis on this issue, and we continue to want to see a lasting peace in Yemen brought through an inclusive political settlement.
Maggie True.
Deputy Speaker, and I commend my honourable friend on his decisive action. The threat posed by Houthi rebels to global trade demonstrates the importance of maintaining a well-resourced armed forces on land, sea and air. Given the current challenges in the recruitment and retention of service personnel, will my reputable friend consider further support for cadet units, such as those excellent ones in my constituency in Ilkeston and Long Eaton, to ensure that we have a trained supply of recruits who are ready and willing to serve?
Can I say, Ronald, that's an excellent idea, and can I pay tribute to all her local cadets for the incredible job they do, and I'm sure the whole House will have experience in their own constituencies of that, and I can say we're introducing a number of ways to improve recruitment in the armed forces and look at more innovative ways to attract people into it, and I know the Defence Secretary will have heard what she said with interest.
Nadine Whittam.
Mr Deputy Speaker, military action in places such as Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, in which the UK has played a part, has frequently resulted in unintended consequences, triggering further cycles of conflict in and around these countries. Will the Prime Minister accept that the US and the UK bombing Yemen risks escalating tensions at a time when violence is spreading in the Middle East? And will he commit to allowing Parliament to vote on any further action?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think the Honourable Lady's characterisation of what we did wasn't right. It was not bombing Yemen, it was taking targeted, limited action against Houthi military sites that were launching attacks on civilian shipping. And it's also worth, as honourable members have said, pointing out the risks of inaction, which you failed to mention, because doing nothing would send a dangerous message that British vessels, British interests and British lives are fair game, and that would be unacceptable.
Helen Cairns.
I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for the action he has taken and for the leadership that he has shown. Can he tell the House what discussions he has had with key influencers and key allies in the region, such as Qatar, Egypt and others who've played a prominent part in seeking to de-escalate tensions in the area?
I can reassure my honourable friend that both I, the Defence Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, are having those conversations. I spoke to President Sisi recently, and indeed all other leaders in the Middle East towards the end of last year, and the Foreign Secretary is engaged as we speak, together with his colleagues, in extensive dialogue to make sure our allies and partners understand what we did and why, and that we remain committed to seeing a peaceful future for everyone living in the Middle East.
Deirdre Brock.
Deputy Speaker, inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency have been denied access to a Russian-occupied Ukrainian nuclear power station for 2 weeks and haven't yet received 2024 maintenance plans for the facility. Could you tell me what assessment the UK government has made of that situation?
Well, I think it just highlights Russia's continuing activity that is malignant and serves to cause everyone alarm, particularly when it comes to the security of nuclear power. The IAEA must have free access to all its sites that it needs to, and there's been a long-standing concern that they haven't been able to have that. We continue to call out Russian behaviour at the UN and elsewhere, and that's what we will do to make sure that they're accountable.
Anthony Magnon.
Deputy Speaker, the freedom of navigation is an uncontested right, whether it's in the South China Sea or on the Gulf of Aden. And before I was in this place, I was a shipping broker. Could the Prime Minister perhaps reassure the shipping industry, of which London remains one of the foremost capitals, that we will be able to lay on more support in terms of armed convoys through the Gulf of Aden and into the Red Sea, and that we will supply as much reassurance and equipment for the Maritime Protection Force that has been mentioned by others?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his excellent question. He'll know, I hope he will have seen the welcome response from the shipping industry, leading shipping companies who have welcomed the action we have taken to restore security to the region. And of course, we are members of Prosperity Guardian, which is something the shipping industry is keen to see, so that we can bring that safety of transit for all their client states. And we'll be in regular dialogue, as the Transport Secretary has been, with them in the coming days and weeks. Ali?
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Since the outbreak of war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, as well as the crisis in shipping security, which has now led to the UK military response to protect British interests, fighting between Hezbollah and Israel is intensifying, risking a wider escalation engulfing Lebanon, Iraq, Syria and other countries. Can the Prime Minister be more specific and tell the House exactly what he's doing, working with the US and regional partners to bring an end to the war in Gaza and stop a full-blown regional conflict that we are all very concerned about?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, what we are doing is calling on Hamas and using our influence with their partners in the region to release hostages, and making sure that we get as much aid into Gaza in the interim, because we know that there's a need for it. We're concerned by the impact it's having, and again, the UK is playing a leading role in alleviating that suffering.
Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his clear statement on this necessary military action in Yemen. Can I join him in paying tribute to our brave armed forces at this time? And can the Prime Minister reaffirm that this action is important for protecting freedom of navigation and the safety of shipping, which has direct and indirect impacts both on world trade and indeed our UK economy?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to point out the impact of what's happening in the Red Sea on British families at home. 15% of global trade passes through this corridor, and as we are seeing, if they have to reroute, that will have a direct consequence on the prices that British families pay. And as we saw with the Ukraine and Russia situation, we can't ignore what is happening. We need to act to protect British people and ensure their economic security.
Adam Kaiser.
Mr Deputy Speaker, of course the Houthi rebels must stop their attacks in the Red Sea. And the Prime Minister was correct in his statement today to speak of the dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen. He's of course spoken at the dispatch box today about the aid delivery to Yemen, yet he failed to mention that successive Conservative governments, both as a cash figure and proportion of ODA, humanitarian aid to Yemen has in fact fallen since 2019. So if the Prime Minister accepts that there is a humanitarian crisis, not just in Yemen of course, but across the globe in Gaza, Ethiopia and other countries, then will his government return to 0.7%, a move that would be supported by members from across the House?
Mr Deputy Speaker, we are I think the 5th largest donor to the UN appeal in Yemen, £1 billion since the conflict started, and we're providing food for at least 100,000 people every month. It's a record that we should be proud of, the UK again leading by example and making an enormous difference around the world.
Jonathan Ginogly.
Deputy Speaker, I think it's since 1875 that the Royal Navy has had a key objective of keeping the Suez Canal open for commercial shipping. So frankly, this should have come as a surprise to no one, and I commend the Prime Minister on his decisive action in that regard. But listening to the statement today, I'm not hearing much of a connection with Gaza. What I am hearing again and again and again from questions are connections to Iran. And it's easy looking at the symptoms, but the causes also need to be looked at. And could I just ask my right honourable friend if he's going to be working with our international allies to deal with the question of Iran?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. That is where the linkage is. It's with the behaviour of the Iranian regime. We agree with the US assessments, and I can give him the reassurance that we are working closely with partners. Obviously, we're taking steps to protect ourselves here at home with the National Security Act and other measures, but of course, internationally, we want to see Iran's influence on the region create less instability, and that's why our interdiction, for example, of illegal arms shipments is so important, and we'll remain actively engaged in how we can do more.
Clive Effort.
Mr Deputy Speaker, clearly we couldn't ignore attacks on international shipping, and we were right to act with international partners, and we must continue to work to broaden that partnership in dealing with the situation as we go forwards. But having said that, can the Prime Minister say just how do we measure success of this limited engagement? How do we deem it to be safe for international shipping to return to the Red Sea? What is the end plan?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his support. I said, on its merits, the specific targets that were selected, our initial assessment is that we have been successful in destroying those, but that remains an initial assessment. We want to see what he said, which is a return of shipping safely to the region. The Transport Secretary is regularly engaging with companies about their passage, but we will continue to do everything we can to ensure that safe passage through the region, working together with our allies.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Iranian-backed Houthis are a terrorist group who have killed hundreds of thousands of Yemenis and are fighting the international recognised government in Yemen. And the action that the UK took with allies earlier last week was absolutely correct. What further efforts are being made by the government to augment and increase the already impressive international coalition that we have to make sure that more countries step up and play their part to ensure freedom of navigation, which is so important for global free trade?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. And we will continue to engage diplomatically to broaden that coalition. Already, as he knows, 14 countries signed the statement, UN Security Council resolution, but ultimately everybody is impacted when freedom of navigation is imperiled, as it is, not just for the security of their citizens, but also because of the shock to their domestic economies from higher inflation. And so I'm confident that we will continue to have a broad coalition for condemning what the Houthis are doing and calling on them to desist.
Chris Law.
Deputy Speaker, after the horrific events of October the 7th, the Prime Minister told this House the UK was working to prevent escalation and that we, and I quote, "we are increasing our presence to prevent broader regional instability at this dangerous moment." Yet in the following months, nearly 24,000 Palestinians have been killed, cross-border fighting with Hezbollah, air raids in Lebanon and Syria, and now Houthi attacks on vessels in the Red Sea, resulting in US and UK strikes in Yemen. So does the Prime Minister accept that attempts to prevent escalation and broader instability are failing, that this cycle of violence must stop, and that this requires an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and an end to the indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in Gaza, no one wants to see the conflict go on a moment longer than is necessary. We support a ceasefire, but it must be a sustainable ceasefire that will last, and that's what we'll continue to work to bring about.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. I congratulate the Prime Minister for his right to act with force, determination and firepower against the Houthi terrorists to protect international shipping and keep the Red Sea shipping lanes open. With the recent deal between Ethiopia and Somaliland opening up the real possibility of international and regional recognition of Somaliland as an independent country, which would help enable stability at the Horn of Africa, the southern end of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK should follow Ethiopia's example and start the process to recognise Somaliland as a sovereign independent country?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his support of our action, and he'll know that the Foreign Office and ministers are regularly engaged with our partners in Africa, and what we want to do is bring prosperity and security to the region, and we'll continue to dialogue with everyone to make sure that that happens.
Valerie Vaz.
Having been born in Aden, I'm obviously saddened that the democratic and humanitarian crisis in Yemen over the last 9 years hasn't provoked such an active response against the Houthis. But could I ask the Prime Minister who advised him not to come to Parliament, and how will he ensure that the peace agreement in Yemen is actively and vigorously monitored and pursued?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, we support the Saudi-Houthi negotiations and the deal that was announced in December by the UN Special Envoy on Yemen. It would urge the Houthis to stop jeopardising the best chance of peace in Yemen in years and engage constructively with that so we can expand the benefits that the truce has brought to the Yemeni people. Of course, we need to see progress from them on that, and once that is done, then hopefully all of us can look forward to a brighter future for the Yemeni people.
David Jones.
Mr Deputy Speaker, there are credible reports that the Houthis who launched missiles at HMS Diamond and the ships of our American allies were trained in their use in Iran by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is therefore a direct threat to our servicemen and women, just as it has for many years been a threat to British citizens on the streets of the United Kingdom. I've heard what my right honourable friend has said about the sanctions that have been applied to the IRGC, but could I urge him that now is the time to proscribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation, because that is what it is.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, I agree with my honourable friend about the destabilising influence of the Iranian regime. We will continue to work constructively with our allies to ensure that we can protect not just our citizens at home, but reduce and degrade Iran's ability to destabilise the region further.
Dame Neil Griffiths.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Well, I very much welcome the Prime Minister's announcement on funding for Ukraine and the UK-Ukraine Security Cooperation Agreement, which, in line with the NATO Ukraine Commission's programme, focuses now on increasing Ukraine's defence industrial base and ensuring that they can provide long-term assistance against Russia's aggression. So can you tell us what discussions he had with President Zelensky about exactly how we will be involved, both government and UK manufacturers, in implementing that in full?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. I think she's absolutely right about the necessity of doing that. It was a feature of our conversations last week, but also we facilitated a visit by some of our leading defence companies to Ukraine at the end of last year to further the cooperation between our two countries, and there's a path forward to see how we can build that, to build the defence industrial base in Ukraine to help them defend themselves in the future.
Nashar.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I first associate myself with all the comments made by the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in the commitment to root out anti-Semitism. It is unacceptable for British Jews to be held responsible for the actions of Israel as a government, and for the idea that British Jews can have any effect there with the Israeli Prime Minister or with his cabinet. In the same vein, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is also true with the rise of Islamophobia, and it really has been a new low and a new painful blow today for the Prime Minister to say to a British Muslim in this House, a member of Coventry South, that she should tell Hamas and Houthis to stop doing what they're doing. That is an Islamophobic trope, Mr Deputy Speaker. Maybe the Prime Minister will reflect, withdraw and take the opportunity to show leadership and apologise. Coming back to the question, Mr Deputy Speaker, the government itself...
Question. I'm going to take it at that, please.
Now, I would say to the Honourable Lady, I have said to all members consistently not to conflate these conflicts, and when they are calling on the UK to de-escalate tensions, to recognise that the people who are causing these situations in the first place is the Hamas terrorist organisation and the Houthis, and it's got nothing to do with anything else other than to recognise the instigators of this violence and illegality and make sure that that is uppermost in everybody's minds when we have these conversations about the best way to respond.
Now, can we really focus on the question, please? Mary Kelly-Foy.
Mr Deputy Speaker, only a handful of MPs have had the chance to scrutinise the Foreign Secretary since his appointment last year. In fact, news presenters have had more opportunities to scrutinise him than we have. Parliament is supposed to be sovereign, and we must be able to scrutinise major decisions like last week's airstrikes. So what steps is the Prime Minister taking to ensure that we in this House can scrutinise the Foreign Secretary and debate and vote on military action?
Mr Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend has made regular statements over the past couple of months about foreign affairs. I am here answering questions about the actions last week, and the Procedure Committee is actively looking at how we can ensure proper accountability and scrutiny, as indeed I gave evidence on that particular topic at the Liaison Committee in December.
Vera Hobhouse.
Deputy Speaker, we must support the recognised Yemeni government, not least by helping them to address the huge problems of malnutrition and hunger. The government has slashed aid by almost £200 million. Now, he has already answered several questions on humanitarian aid, but can I ask him directly, will he reverse the cuts to the aid budget in order to address the human suffering in Yemen, which only fuel the success of the Houthi terrorists?
I was proud that we hosted a food security summit, which was warmly welcomed by vulnerable countries last year. But perhaps the Honourable Lady could tell the House how she would propose to pay for the £5 billion increase in the aid budget that she is proposing.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. While the Prime Minister has clarified that the strikes in Yemen are disassociated with Gaza, the Iranian arc has drawn a different conclusion, not least as the strikes took place on the same day as the ICJ case brought by South Africa. We know the only way forward is de-escalation in the light that assaults continue in the Merchant Navy and assaults in Gaza continue also over the weekend. When will he condemn the attacks by Israel on civilians and call for an immediate ceasefire?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've addressed that previously, but with regard to South Africa's referral of Israel to the ICJ, that development is unhelpful. We don't agree with it, and I don't believe it is right. As we've previously stated, Israel does have a right to take action in self-defence against Hamas, and it's important that it does that in accordance with international humanitarian law, and we will continue to make that point to them.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We're now in a very dangerous
dangerous moment where the war in Gaza risks spreading into a much wider and even more deadly war across the Middle East. There is a real risk our country finds itself in yet another war in the Middle East that it cannot get out of easily. To avoid any wider war, don't we now need an emphasis on de-escalation and diplomatic efforts? And doesn't the need to seek such a wider diplomatic solution make it more urgent to be pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza?
Mr. Deputy Speaker said no one wants to see the conflict in Gaza go on a moment longer than is necessary. We support a ceasefire, but it must be a sustainable ceasefire that will last. And that means Hamas no longer in power in Gaza, no longer able to threaten Israel with rocket attacks and other forms of terrorism. And Hamas simply does not represent the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Some in the House may recall that one of my constituents was held captive by the Houthis for 5 years simply for being in possession of a British passport. I'm glad, and the House will know that we were able to get him safely returned. So we should be under no illusions about the nature of the Houthis. But can I re-emphasise the importance of minimising any civilian casualties in any action that the UK is involved with? And can he impress that not only upon our highly professional armed forces, but also upon our partners in any actions that are taken by the UK?
I can give the Honourable Gentleman that assurance, and again, our initial assessment is that we were successful in minimising civilian casualties in this case.
Richard Ford.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, there are times when a government needs to take military action without the approval of Parliament, including for operational security or for the element of surprise. But last week's strikes were signalled very plainly in the media. The strikes could have been debated, voted on and supported by this House in advance of action. Tomorrow I will table a bill which will require parliamentary approval for the engagement of UK armed forces in armed conflict, even if it is retrospective. Will the Prime Minister support it?
As I said, it was necessary to act with speed so that we could allow our armed forces to maintain the vital security of their operations and ensure the effectiveness. I believe that is in accordance with the Convention on the Deployment of Military Force, and as I said previously, we must maintain the prerogative powers that allow the Executive to act in such emergencies, but I'm here in Parliament to explain the action in full and take responsibility for it.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister earlier in the statement stated that the Houthis were aided by Iranian military intelligence assets to target British shipping. Now, does that mean the UK government considers Iranian military intelligence assets to be legitimate targets for future military strikes?
So what I said was that we agree with the US assessment that Iran has supported Houthi attacks and providing intelligence in a general sense to enable Houthi targeting of vessels. I've talked already about the destabilising influence of Iran in the region and indeed the threat it poses to the UK, which is why we have taken significant and decisive action to protect ourselves against it and will continue to work with our allies to restrain their malign influence.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. As much as the Houthis might wish to conflate their piracy with support for the Palestinian people, their indiscriminate attacks on shipping from across the world indicates otherwise. But whilst I agree that under international law there was justification for this military intervention, what was his assessment of the risk that this action could ignite conflict across the Middle East, and on the appearance of double standards on when the UK or its allies chooses to observe international law?
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we always will strive and make sure that we comply with international law as we did in this case, but we should also recognise the risks of inaction, because doing nothing would very clearly weaken international security and the rule of law, damage freedom of navigation and the global economy, but crucially send a very dangerous message that British vessels, British lives and British interests are fair game, and that is not something that we could allow to stand.
McLaughlin.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, in his statement, the Prime Minister told us one of his motives was the ordinary people of Yemen. He said the Houthis' attacks risk worsening the dire situation, the humanitarian situation in Yemen itself, before patting himself on the back about the number of people that the UK helps to feed in Yemen. And he's not wrong about the Houthis. However, surely the biggest threat to Yemen, the people of Yemen, is the cuts that have been made to the international aid budget. 2 years ago, they cut it from £221 million a year to £81 million, an eye-watering cut. So will he restore that aid? And if not, does he understand why those of us in the SNP remain unconvinced of his motives?
Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, we are proudly one of the largest contributors of aid to Yemen, and indeed it is the Houthis, by disrupting shipping, that are disrupting the very supplies of food that is necessary to feed their people. And when it comes to increasing the aid budget, I took the decision I did because I believed it was in our country's best interest, given the financial situation of the country post-COVID. But we now know that Scotland is the highest tax part of the United Kingdom economy, so perhaps the Honourable Lady can explain to the British people what taxes she would increase to pay for an increase in the aid budget.
Paul Blomfield.
Speaker, the Prime Minister is right when he says as a consequence of inaction just as there is of action. And clearly the Houthis gave no alternative but to the response that has come from the UK and our allies. But he also said, I thought incredibly, that their attacks on shipping were completely unrelated to the appalling civil war in Yemen, for which they are entirely responsible and which has claimed almost 380,000 lives. Surely it had everything to do with that conflict, and there is a concern that the Houthis' political position has been strengthened inside Yemen and beyond as a result of the actions on both sides. So what assessment has he made of the impact of the action on the peace process, and could he spell out what more, not what we have done, what we've been involved in, but what more we will do to achieve a political solution and a political settlement in Yemen?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, what I said is our response was not linked to the conflict in Gaza and should not be or conflated as being so. Now, as I said, we are a penholder on Yemen in the UN Security Council, so we actually diplomatically engage extensively with allies, notably the Saudis, to see if we can support the deal that was announced in December. We will continue to do so. Obviously, it's for the Houthis that the onus is on to engage with that process to bring about peace and stability for the people of Yemen.
Leila Moran.
Deputy Speaker, nothing angers me more than those who choose to use the plight of the Palestinians to further their own nefarious ends. And this applies to Iran primarily, but also their proxies. Does the Prime Minister accept that the best way to pull out the rug from under the Iranian regime is to achieve that two-state solution by way of an immediate bilateral ceasefire in this conflict now?
As I've said previously, we do support ceasefire, but it must be sustainable, and that means multiple things have to happen for it to be so. And as I said previously, we remain committed to a two-state solution, because I believe in a future, as does this government, and I think this House, where Palestinian and Israeli people can live side by side in peace and security, and everyone can live their lives with dignity and opportunity. That is the future that we are striving to build.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the remarks from the Prime Minister about the situation in Ukraine and our commitment to that. But in the Middle East, the escalation and conflagration of the situation there has seen obviously just beyond the 23,000 deaths of civilians, including children, is really quite shocking, but it's now extending to a crisis of other nations more widely and across the world. Does he agree with me that we do need to see a negotiated ceasefire in Gaza, and that ultimately, 30 years on now from the Oslo Accords, we have to see a deal which is land for peace negotiated?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, no one wants to see this conflict go on a moment longer than is necessary. We support a ceasefire, but it must be a sustainable ceasefire that will last, and that means Hamas releasing hostages, but also no longer able to threaten Israel with rocket attacks and other forms of terrorism. And in the meantime, we will do everything we can to get more aid into Gaza.
Brian.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's obvious that the longer the conflict in Gaza goes on, the greater number of innocent civilian casualties will be, and the greater the risk of wider escalation in that region. Isn't it the case, if the UK is to be seen as an honest broker, as well as rightly condemning Hamas, The Prime Minister needs to call out Israel for clear breaches of humanitarian law, call for an immediate ceasefire, and also, instead of actors like China, who are now calling for an international conference to set a timetable for a two-state solution, wouldn't it be much better if the UK was actually doing something constructive to get that two-state solution in place?
Good question. We continue to call for international humanitarian law to be respected and for civilians to be protected. Too many civilians have been killed, and as has been clear, Israel should do more to ensure that its campaign is targeted on Hamas leaders and their operatives.
Beth Winter.
Deputy Speaker. Freya Al-Muslim, a research fellow at Chatham House, has argued the attacks on Yemen will have the opposite effect, instigating a widened Houthi campaign, including attacks on US and UK installations across the Arabian Peninsula. So can I ask the Prime Minister, if the Houthi operations continue, as they have done in the last couple of days, and UK and US military responses persist, what is the end game? And how much death and destruction is this country risking if we do not prioritise the cessation of military action in Yemen and the Red Sea, but also, crucially, in Gaza, the West Bank and Israel?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady talks about the cessation of military action in the Red Sea. It is the Houthis that are conducting illegal strikes on civilian shipping, and to do nothing in the face of that, I think, would be to weaken our security and leave British interests and lives at risk.
Alan Dorrance.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and good afternoon. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we've seen from earlier events in Iraq, Libya and elsewhere that United Kingdom and United States military intervention has resulted in destabilisation and subsequent civil wars with massive loss of civilian life. What, if anything, is the Prime Minister making in terms of diplomatic efforts to prevent this happening in Yemen?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, as I've pointed out previously, several countries, 14 in which signed a statement earlier this year calling on the Houthis to desist what they were doing and said there would be consequences, and we've had a UN Security Council resolution condemning Houthi activity and noting the right of states to take self-defence, and that's what we did. We acted in a proportionate and necessary way in a direct threat to UK vessels and therefore to the UK itself.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Many people are deeply worried about the escalation of hostilities and growing instability across the region. There must be an accelerated determination to bring about an urgently needed ceasefire in Gaza and hostage release. And if the bombing doesn't deter the awful actions of the Houthi rebels, what is the Prime Minister's plan B?
I'd say to the Honourable Lady as well, there is in all cases a risk of inaction. In the face of attacks on civilian lives, British interests, it would have been wrong to do nothing. There have been extensive diplomatic activity, and this military action was limited, it was proportionate and necessary, and it was in self-defence. I believe that was the right course of action, and to do nothing would have been to be wrong.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister said earlier, quite rightly, that we must condemn the Houthis and their illegal strikes on innocent civilians to protect the rule of law. So will we also condemn Israel and illegal strikes against innocent civilians, including 10,000 dead children, to protect the self-same rule of law?
Yeah, exactly.
As I've said repeatedly, we are deeply concerned about the devastating impact of the fighting in Gaza on the civilian population. Too many people have lost their lives already, and there is a desperate need to increase humanitarian support to Gaza. That is what we're doing, and calling Israel to abide by international humanitarian law and to do everything they can to protect civilian life.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This is there's a greater conflict in the Middle East now than there has been for many years. In Lebanon, Syria and Iraq, as well as Yemen, Israel and Palestine, much of it stoked by hostile actors. The Prime Minister has told us what his military response is presently. What specifically diplomatic initiative is he pursuing to promote Britain's historic role towards peace in the Middle East?
Well, the honourable gentleman will know I was one of the first foreign leaders to visit the region after the attacks and meet with all the leaders from across the region, including all the Arab states and President Abbas from the Palestinian Authority. And we are working with them to make sure that they have the capability for a post-Gaza future and how best to deliver that, as well as working with other Arab partners about increasing the supply of aid in and working towards a more peaceful long-term future.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to point to the consequences for all of our constituents of these direct attacks on shipping by the Houthi. He's also right to talk about the dangers of inaction. But can I add my voice to those today who have pointed to our inaction in this place towards the Iranian Revolutionary Guard? And we see the malign hand of Iran throughout the Middle East now, creating situation after situation. So does the Prime Minister not think that the time has come to prohibit the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and describe them as a terrorist organisation?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we don't comment on prescription decisions, but I agree with the Honourable Lady that the behaviour of the Iranian regime, including the IRGC, does pose a significant threat to the safety and security of the UK and our allies. That's why we've sanctioned over 400 individuals, including the IRGC in its entirety. We've passed new laws like the National Security Act, which give us the powers we need to keep us safe, and we will continue to work closely with allies to make sure we implement the most effective ways of reducing Iran's malign influence in the region.
Final question, Jonathan Edwards.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister has emphasised throughout the debate that it was not an act of escalation, but surely the key determinant of that is how the action is perceived by forces in the Middle East and the wider Arab population. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan and Egypt, countries we would not describe as anti-Western in any way, have all expressed varying degrees of concern. Is he not worried at all that many of the key players in the region view the military action as escalatory?
I don't believe that we can outsource our foreign policy to the perception of what other countries might have. And we should recognise the risks of inaction. To do nothing, as I've said, would be to weaken international security and the rule of law. It would further damage freedom of navigation and the global economy, including those for British families here. And crucially, to do nothing would send a dangerous message that British vessels, British interests and British lives are fair game. And that would be completely unacceptable. And that is why it's right that we acted.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for his statement today and responding to questions for just 5 minutes short of 2 hours. Thank you very much. Point of order, Zara Sultana.
Order, Mr Deputy Speaker, and in line with the House's rules, I informed the member in question that I would be referencing him. In the previous statement, the member for Brigg and Goole implied that I had just, and I quote, given a free pass to the terrorists who carried out the October the 7th attack. Mr Deputy Speaker, that claim is grotesquely untrue. My question to the Prime Minister in no way had that implication. I was calling for a de-escalation in the region and for an immediate ceasefire, and his accusation is absolutely untrue. In this House and elsewhere, I have repeatedly condemned the actions of Hamas and called for the release of all hostages. Moreover, the member's gross accusation is playing to a racist trope, implying that because I am a Muslim, I support Hamas. So with rising Islamophobia and racist tropes asking British Muslims to prove their loyalty, can I ask you for guidance on how to get a full retraction and apology from the member for Brigg and Goole?
Further to that point of order, Andrew Percy.
As loath as I am to engage in this silliness, let me be absolutely clear. Let me be absolutely clear to the Honourable Lady. Not only did I not reference her, I have on numerous, if she would let me, if she'd listen to the response, on numerous occasions I have said too many people have failed to call out what I think is unacceptable. I've said that before. I'm not going to stop saying that I think people have given a free pass on occasions to behaviour and have not dealt with this with a fair hand. That is an open point of debate. I have called people out on my own side for that. If she could sit here and listen to me, it has absolutely nothing to do with the thing. But I don't want to engage in this silliness. So I will say to the Honourable Lady, I have absolutely no intention of inferring at all that she is in any... Let me respond, that she is in any way in support of any of that. I'm sure she isn't. I never said that. I would never say that. But I'm also, Mr Deputy Speaker, not going to not say what I think on issues in this House and call out what I think is on this issue. Too many people in this place giving a free pass to one side whilst not acknowledging the horrors that the other side suffered.
Thank you. I'm going to allow that on both sides to stand on the record. Leila Moran, point of order.
On a point of order, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to seek your guidance on the Parliamentary Convention regarding the deployment of UK armed forces for armed conflict. The Prime Minister will have heard the consternation from members across the House about MPs having a say on this deployment to troops in the Red Sea. There is a convention that was forged in the fire of the Iraq war debates that this House has its say in advance of any military action. This was confirmed on the floor of this House on the 10th of March 2011 under the then Prime Minister, now Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron, when the Leader of the House said, and I quote, "We propose to observe that convention except where there is an emergency and such action would not be appropriate." Now, we are told that these strikes have to be debated, were about to happen for weeks, so it's not an emergency. And the Prime Minister mentioned a process in 2015, I presume, to do with Iraq. But in that justification on the floor of this House again, the Minister said that it was not military action. In fact, it is only the 2018 lack of vote and debate that is the aberration since 2002. So the question I have for you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is does this Prime Minister observe the convention, and what is the guidance for this House, what is the process to ensure that we can hold the government to account on this matter that should have urgent consideration?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for her point of order and giving me advance notice of it. Since 2011, the government has recognised the convention that before troops are committed, this House should have an opportunity to debate the matter. The government has undertaken, in the Cabinet Manual and in statements to this House, to observe that convention, except when there is an emergency and such action would not be appropriate. It is for the government to explain to the House why prior parliamentary authorisation was not appropriate in this case, and as she will have heard, he was asked directly by Mr Ford about pre-authorisation, and the House heard the Prime Minister's response to that question. So thank you very much. We will now pass on to the presentation of bills. Sarah Olney. And the bill.
Airports Prohibition of Night Flights Bill.
Second reading what day?
21st of June.
The 21st of June. Thank you very much. We now come to motion number 1 relating to the Speaker's absence, and I call the Leader of the House to move.
Move formally.
Moved formally. The question is, as on the order papers. May I have that say aye? Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Bill, Committee.
Now, before the House resolves itself into committee, I draw the House's attention to the instruction motion on the order paper in the name of Sir Geoffrey Donaldson to allow the committee to make provision for the whole of the United Kingdom. It is subject to selection by the Chair, and the Speaker has decided to select the motion. Is it you, Sammy Wilson? Right. I will call Sammy Wilson to move the instruction motion.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And first of all, can I thank the Speaker for selecting this instruction, and secondly to the Clerk for the help and advice which has been given. The reason for bringing forward this instruction is that this bill, as is clear on the face of the bill, applies only to the export of animals from Great Britain. It does not include Northern Ireland. And of course, in doing so, an important piece of animal welfare legislation will not be applying to the whole of the United Kingdom, but in fact a significant part of the United Kingdom, because a significant number of animal exports come from Northern Ireland, will be excluded. And this exclusion actually is a very important exclusion, because the most likely source of exports of animals which will suffer as a result of long journeys is Northern Ireland. Because as a result of the exclusion of Northern Ireland from this bill, animals can be taken from Northern Ireland, exported through the Irish Republic, taken on a 23-hour boat journey to the European mainland, and then carried down to the south of Spain, France, or indeed further abroad. So the degree of suffering that animals are likely to experience as a result of the exclusion of Northern Ireland from this bill is very severe. And yet the whole point of the bill was to reduce animal suffering, to ensure that live exports did not happen, which could lead to animal suffering. Let me just remind the House what this journey entails. Because in a letter from the last Minister for Agriculture in Northern Ireland, I was informed that when animals were taken from Northern Ireland to a 300-odd mile journey through the Irish Republic, and they get to Rosslare, there was no necessity to feed them at that rest point. They'd be put on a ship for a 23-hour journey without being fed, and that still enabled the exporters to comply with EU safety regulations. Now, I put it to the House that if this bill is about reducing suffering for animals when it comes to live exports, then this is a huge gap, and it's one which needs to be it's closed. Now, the Minister is likely to tell us that there are a number of reasons why this can't be done. The first is that if we included Northern Ireland, then a substantial number of exports from Northern Ireland into the Irish Republic, and there are substantial exports, would be affected. If this instruction were accepted, then there would be an opportunity for this House to consider an amendment in the name of my party colleagues that would restrict the export of animals to the named destinations in the Republic of Ireland only. So it wouldn't affect that trade. But that motion cannot, and that amendment cannot be considered unless this instruction is taken by the House and Northern Ireland is included. Now, the Minister is likely to argue that that would be contrary to WT rules, so there's no point even in proposing such an amendment. But again, there is an area here which the government should be testing, because even under WTO rules, exceptions can be made. You can exclude trade with certain countries or regions on the basis of the impact on animal welfare health. Now, it might well be that, of course, when it is tested, the rule will prove not to be effective. But at least by including Northern Ireland in this bill, by accepting the amendment which would be subsequently capable of being debated in this House and voted on, that exception could be tested. So I think that the first argument that, look, there's no point in this because any subsequent amendments couldn't work, that is not true. The second reason that it would stop exports from to the Irish Republic, that can be dealt with. The other argument which I suspect, though the Minister, to be fair, to date has not used this, I don't know if because he doesn't feel it's politic or because he doesn't believe it is important, is that under the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework, Northern Ireland, certain laws made in this House cannot apply to Northern Ireland. Now, the reason for that, according to the EU, is to safeguard the EU single market and to ensure no damage is done to the EU single market. I don't see how anyone could argue that the export of live animals from Northern Ireland to the EU single market damages, or prohibiting that, damages the EU single market. It doesn't stand to reason. So there is no reasons, and no reason, why Northern Ireland cannot be included in this bill. And while this is an unusual procedure, could I point out to the Minister that less than a year ago, this House accepted a similar instruction when it came to the Dahi's law for the transfer of organs for health reasons, without any division. Why? Because there was support in Northern Ireland for it. I'm not aware of any political party in Northern Ireland which would oppose the inclusion of Northern Ireland in the animal welfare legislation which is going before this House tonight. I would ask the Minister, I promise the Speaker will be brief and I'm going to conclude, but I ask the Minister to accept this without division. There's logic to it. The government's got an objective of protecting the welfare of animals. There's a gap which has been identified. That gap can be closed. The inclusion of Northern Ireland in the bill would reinforce the view that Northern Ireland is, and the claim that the government makes that Northern Ireland is fully part of the United Kingdom. Here is an opportunity for the Minister and for the government to show that that's the case by including Northern Ireland in this piece of legislation, protecting the welfare of animals who will be subject to extreme suffering as a result of being exported all around the European Union. And I hope that the whole House will accept that there is no case, absolutely no case, for excluding Northern Ireland either on constitutional grounds, on grounds of animal welfare, on grounds of the objectives which this government has set itself to protect animal welfare, and that the House will accept this instruction without any opposition, so that Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom can be recognised, animal welfare can be protected, and the government's objectives can be achieved for every part of the United Kingdom.
The question is that it be an instruction to the Committee on the Animal Welfare Livestock Exports Bill that the committee have leave to make provision for the whole of the United Kingdom. The Minister has indicated that he would like to respond at the end to this particular instruction, and I'll call him and any other front benches before then. I'm having one indication. Thank you. I now call Stephen Farry.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I too will be very brief on this. I have enormous sympathy for this motion of instruction, and just for the record, while we did actually suggest a motion of instruction around Daffy's Law, it didn't actually come to that point because the Secretary of State intervened beforehand in a very sensible way. But I do think we have to recognise that Northern Ireland is part of a different legal framework and also a different context. Particularly the large-scale movements on the island of Ireland, and indeed, no less than the Ulster Farmers Union have made representations around the need to treat the issue of the island of Ireland differently from what's happening in terms of Great Britain. We also appreciate that the DUP do wish to have another amendment to cover or to make an exemption for movements on the island of Ireland. The difficulty there is, though, if we end up in a situation where this is not addressed at the European Union level, you can see a situation where simply we see re-exportation happening in terms of companies based in the Republic of Ireland, which will actually defeat the purpose of what they're trying to achieve. The answer really lies in terms of this being addressed at an EU level, with the Northern Ireland Assembly, hopefully a restored Northern Ireland Assembly, having a pivotal role in that regard, and working very closely with local stakeholders, including the Ulster Farmers Union and indeed local animal welfare organisations. I am conscious that the European Union is actively looking at this issue, and perhaps I could ask the Secretary of State, whenever he's responding, to comment on what steps the UK government could do to support those wider efforts within the European, and appreciate we're not part of the EU, at least for now, and how that can be best taken forward. Because I think it's fair to say that the people of Northern Ireland care as deeply about this issue and animal welfare as their colleagues elsewhere in the UK, but we have to find a bespoke solution that addresses our very particular circumstances, and so I think we have to proceed in that light, and appreciate that there is complications here which do require more work to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first to say it is a pleasure to speak on this issue, and can I also declare an interest, Mr Deputy Speaker, as a member of the Ulster Farmers Union and also a landowner. The issue is one which I've been carefully watching for some time, and along with my party, we're discouraged by the fact that this was not a UK-wide bill, and subsequently we have submitted the amendments, which I trust will be, as my honourable friend, Right Honourable Member for East Antrim referred to, will be accepted by government in the chamber tonight. It's essential that the rules governing this issue are UK-wide and that the animal welfare protection is also UK-wide.